In a climate-controlled storage room beneath one of the most heavily guarded archaeological institutions in the world, there is a clay tablet that almost no one has ever seen. It does not appear in any public catalog. It is not displayed in any museum. The handful of researchers who have been allowed to examine it have signed agreements that prevent them from speaking about its contents in any detail. What we know about this tablet, we know only because of fragments. A whispered description from a translator who later recanted everything he said. A blurred photograph that surfaced on an academic forum for less than an hour before it was scrubbed from the internet. A single line of cuneiform copied into the margin of a notebook by a graduate student who lost his career shortly afterward. And from these fragments, a picture emerges. A picture so strange, so unsettling, so completely at odds with everything we have been told about the ancient world that to describe it openly is to invite ridicule at best and professional ruin at worst. Because according to those fragments, this tablet describes the world. Not the world as we know it, not a flat plane, not a globe, but something in between. A vast circular landmass surrounded by an outer wall of ice that no one has ever crossed, covered by a solid transparent dome that bends the sky into shapes the ancients could read like a map. And on the other side of that dome, according to the tablet, there is something. Something that watches. Something that built it. Something that put us here for a reason that the Sumerians knew, and that we have spent 5,000 years being persuaded to forget. The Sumerians did not invent stories. They wrote down what they were told by beings they called the Anunnaki, those who came down from heaven to earth, beings who, according to dozens of tablets that you can read for yourself in the British Museum and the Iraq Museum and the Pergamon in Berlin, gave the first humans agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, law, and a strict warning about something they called the firmament, the thing above us, the thing that contains us, the thing that, in the description preserved on this hidden tablet, has a far side, and on that far side, the Anunnaki say, something is still there. This is the story of that tablet, of the men who saw it, of the institutions that buried it, of the desperate effort by a small number of researchers to piece together what it actually says, and of the implications that have now begun to leak out in academic papers that are mysteriously withdrawn, in interviews that are quietly redacted, in late-night conversations between scholars who suddenly remember that their careers are not their own. By the end of this video, you will understand why the most powerful institutions on Earth have decided that you are not allowed to know what is written on a piece of dried clay that was made in the city of Nippur more than 4,000 years ago. And you will understand what it actually says. Before we go any further into the dark, settle in. Get comfortable. Lower the lights. This is going to be a long journey, and the pieces only fit together when you take them slowly, in order the way the Sumerians themselves laid them down. If you find this kind of investigation valuable, if you want to keep being shown the things that the official histories refuse to address, then take a moment right now to subscribe and tap the bell. Hit the like button while you are at it. None of this content survives without the people who choose to support it, and the algorithm rewards engagement above almost everything else. So if you want more buried tablets, more silenced translators, more forbidden chapters of the human story, your single click does more than you realize. We are going deep tonight, 3,500 years deep, and then deeper, to the moment before the dome, to the moment before us. Stay with me. The civilization we call Sumer rose in the marshes between two rivers in what is now southern Iraq, somewhere around 6,000 years ago. They did not call themselves Sumerians. They called themselves the black-headed people. The land they inhabited, they called Kengir. The cities they built, names that even now have a strange power to them: Eridu, Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, Ur, Kish, Larsa. These were not villages. They were dense urban centers with populations in the tens of thousands, arranged around enormous step temple structures called ziggurats, irrigated by canal systems that we are only beginning to understand the engineering of, governed by complex bureaucracies that produced, by some estimates, more written documents than any other ancient civilization combined. The clay tablets recovered from the ruins of these cities now number in the hundreds of thousands. Most of them have never been translated. Many of them have never been read. They sit in wooden trays in storage rooms in Philadelphia, in London, in Istanbul, in Berlin, in Baghdad, waiting for someone to look at them. There are not enough scholars in the world to keep up. There never have been. And inside those untranslated stacks, according to multiple sources who have worked in those rooms, there are things that no one wants to translate. Things that, when an enthusiastic young researcher does happen to translate them, are quietly removed from the active collection and returned to a different shelf. A shelf that is not cataloged. A shelf that has no number. A shelf that, in at least one major museum, is reportedly behind a locked door that requires 3 separate signatures to open. The hidden tablet we are going to discuss tonight is, according to the testimony of a man we will get to in a moment, on that shelf. It is not the only one, but it is, by his account, the most important one. Because it answers a question that the rest of the Sumerian corpus only hints at. The question of what the Anunnaki actually were. The question of where they actually came from. The question of what is actually above us, holding us in place. To understand why this tablet matters, you have to understand what the Sumerians were doing when they wrote it. Cuneiform, the writing system they invented, is the oldest known writing in the world. Older than Egyptian hieroglyphs. Older than Chinese characters. Older than anything. It began as a system of accounting. Simple pictograms pressed into wet clay with the sharpened end of a reed, used to keep track of bushels of barley and heads of cattle and jars of beer owed to the temple. But within a few centuries, it had evolved into something extraordinary. A fully phonetic script capable of capturing the most subtle nuances of human language. Poetry, law, prayer, letter writing, mathematical proofs, medical diagnoses, real estate contracts, recipes, lullabies, lists of kings stretching back, in the most famous version, to a time before what they called the Flood, when individual rulers reportedly lived for tens of thousands of years, and the gods walked openly among men. That king list, which you can read translated into English in any university library, claims that the first human civilization received its kingship directly from the sky, not as a metaphor, as a literal event, a descent, the Anunnaki coming down from a place above to install rulers on a world below. And that descent, the Sumerians wrote, was made possible because the place above and the place below were separated by a structure, a barrier, a boundary, a thing they had multiple names for, but which the standard scholarly translation has rendered for over a century as the firmament, the dome, the ceiling of the world. They did not write about it as a poetic concept. They wrote about it the way we would write about a piece of architecture. They described its material. They described its shape. They described the windows in it through which water sometimes fell. They described the gates through which the sun and the moon entered and exited each day. They described the great pillars at its edges. They described, in some passages, the men who maintained it, the keepers, the watchers, the ones who, when one of them fell, was said to have left a trail of fire across the sky. We have been taught to read all of this as primitive cosmology, the naive imagination of a people who did not know any better. We have been taught that the dome was a metaphor, that the Anunnaki were imaginary, that the kings of legend were ordinary men whose stories grew taller in the telling. We have been taught, in short, to take the most carefully kept written records of the longest continuously literate civilization in human history and treat them as the babbling of children. But the Sumerians were not children. They were one of the most precise, most obsessive, most relentlessly accurate cultures the world has ever produced. They mapped the stars to a level of precision that we did not match again until the 17th century. They calculated the cycles of the planets to within minutes of their actual periods. They invented zero, place value mathematics, the 60-base counting system that we still use to tell time, and the concept of the calendar year. When they wrote that something happened, they meant that it happened. When they wrote that something existed, they meant that it existed. And when they wrote that there was a dome above the earth with a far side, and that something on that far side put them there, the question we have to ask is not whether they believed it. The question we have to ask is what they actually saw. The man who first told the world that this hidden tablet existed was named, for the purposes of his published work, Dr. M. He was, before his career ended in 1998, one of the senior Assyriologists at a museum we will not name here, because his family has asked that we not name it. He had been working with cuneiform texts for over 30 years. He had translated portions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis flood narrative, the Lamentations of Ur, and several of the Sumerian king lists. He was, by all accounts of his colleagues, a meticulous scholar with no interest in the speculative side of ancient history. He had publicly mocked more than once the work of Zecharia Sitchin, whose theories about the Anunnaki as flesh and blood astronauts had become popular in the 1970s and 1980s. Dr. M considered Sitchin a charlatan. He considered the ancient astronaut hypothesis a distraction from real scholarship. He considered himself a defender of the academic mainstream. And then, in the spring of 1996, he was given access to a collection of tablets that had been transferred decades earlier from the basement of a now-defunct museum in eastern Turkey to the climate-controlled archives of the institution where he worked. The collection had been sitting untouched, in unmarked wooden crates, for over 40 years. He was the first scholar to open the crates. What he found, he later wrote in a private journal that was published only after his death, changed everything he thought he knew about the ancient world. The collection contained approximately 300 tablets. Most of them were ordinary: tax records, marriage contracts, templates for letters, schoolboy exercises in basic cuneiform. But near the bottom of the third crate, wrapped in what appeared to be a piece of much older oiled cloth, was a single intact tablet, slightly larger than the standard rectangular shape, with cuneiform that was unusually small and dense, packed into the available surface as though the scribe had needed to fit a great deal of information onto a single piece of clay. The tablet had no inventory number, it had no provenance card, it had no record of how it had entered the original Turkish museum. It had simply been there. Dr. M took it to his desk, placed it under a magnifying lamp, and began the slow process of reading it. He worked on it for 3 days. By the third day, his hands were shaking. By the fourth day, he had stopped going home. What Dr. M read on that tablet, he later told a single colleague, was a description of the structure of the world. Not the world as the Sumerians normally described it, in poetic terms, full of gods and metaphors, but the world as a piece of engineering, a thing built, a thing with measurements, a thing with components. The tablet began, as many Sumerian texts begin, with an invocation of the older gods, the ones who existed before the present arrangement. It named An, the Sky Father. It named Kai, the Earth Mother. It named Enki, the Lord of the freshwater abyss, the God of wisdom, the one who, in many Sumerian texts, is the engineer of humankind. And then it shifted into a register that Dr. M had never seen before in any cuneiform text. It became technical, it listed dimensions. It used numerical terms that did not match the standard Sumerian counting system. It described, according to his preliminary translation, a structure with 3 layers. The lowest layer was the inhabited world. The middle layer was the sky, which it called by a word that Dr. M initially translated as canopy and later revised to vault. The highest layer was the place of the older ones, the place where the Anunnaki had originated, the place from which they had descended through gates in the vault to walk among men. Between the middle layer and the lowest layer, the tablet described a transparent material, hard like the strongest stone, but clear like the finest crystal, through which the lights of the upper world could be seen. This material, the tablet said, formed a single continuous shell over the inhabited world, anchored at its edges to a circular ring of mountains made of ice. Beyond those mountains of ice, the tablet said, no man had ever traveled and returned. The Anunnaki had warned the first humans that the boundary was not to be crossed, that what lay beyond it was not for human eyes, that the very act of attempting to cross it would result in the violation of an agreement, an agreement that the older gods had made with something the tablet called, in a phrase that Dr. M struggled with for 2 days before settling on a translation, the ones who watch from outside the shell. Dr. M wrote in his journal that when he reached this passage, he closed the tablet in its protective covering and walked out of the storage room without telling anyone what he had read. He went home. He did not sleep. He returned the next morning, opened the covering, and continued translating. He did not tell his supervisor. He did not tell his colleagues. He told no one. For the next 18 months, he worked on this tablet in secret, in stolen hours, after the rest of the staff had left the building. He photographed it from every angle. He made rubbings. He copied the cuneiform character by character into a leather notebook that he kept locked in a drawer in his apartment. He cross-referenced its terminology against every other Sumerian text he could find. He consulted Akkadian, Hurrian, Eblate, and Old Babylonian dictionaries. He stayed up until 4 a.m. many nights, drinking black coffee, smoking the cigarettes he had given up years earlier, watching the lines of the tablet resolve themselves into something he could no longer pretend was a metaphor. The dome, the tablet said, was not infinitely high. It had a measurable thickness. The Anunnaki had given the first king of Eridu, a being whose name appears at the very top of the Sumerian king list, the precise dimensions of this thickness, in a unit that translates roughly into one of the standard Sumerian length measurements, multiplied by a factor that Dr. M was never able to verify against any known Sumerian arithmetic. The dome had structures embedded within it. The tablet listed them. Lights, both fixed and wandering, set into the inner surface of the shell. Channels through which fluids moved, presumably what the older texts had described as the upper waters, the source of rain. Gates, large enough for the descending Anunnaki to pass through, located at specific points above the great mountain ranges of the inhabited world, and openings, small ones, scattered across the dome at irregular intervals, through which, the tablet said, the watchers from beyond could observe what was happening below. The tablet did not call these openings windows. It used a word that Dr. M translated, after considerable hesitation, as eyes. The dome had eyes. The eyes were watching, and the eyes were not alone. According to the next passage of the tablet, the watchers were not the gods. The watchers were not the Anunnaki. The watchers were something else, something older, something that the Anunnaki themselves were afraid of, something that, the tablet said, had built the dome before the Anunnaki ever arrived, before the first human ever drew breath, before the inhabited world itself had been shaped into its present form. The dome, the tablet said, was a containment, a boundary, a cage. The Anunnaki had not built it. The Anunnaki had found it. They had arrived from a place beyond it, and they had been allowed to enter, but only under conditions imposed by the Watchers. The conditions involved the cultivation of human civilization, the cultivation of human consciousness. The cultivation, the tablet said in a phrase that Dr. M circled 3 times in his notebook, of something that the Watchers wanted from us, something that was harvested, something that, when we produced enough of it, the Watchers would come to collect. And then, the tablet said, the cycle would begin again. Dr. M did not finish his translation. In the autumn of 1997, he was approached by 2 men who identified themselves as representatives of a foundation that had recently donated a large sum to his museum. They wanted to discuss, they said, his current research. He had not told anyone about his current research. He had not published anything related to it. He had not even mentioned it to his wife. He met with them in his office. The meeting lasted, according to his journal, less than 15 minutes. He never wrote down what was said. But the next day, he requested an emergency leave of absence, citing health concerns. 3 weeks later, he was admitted to a private clinic in the Swiss Alps for what was described in a memo circulated to museum staff as exhaustion. He never returned to work. He never spoke publicly about cuneiform again. He died in 2003 of what was officially recorded as a heart attack in his sleep at the age of 64. His wife, executor of his estate, found his journal hidden behind a panel in his study and gave a copy of it 8 years later to one of his former graduate students. That graduate student, who has chosen to remain anonymous, transcribed the relevant portions of the journal and circulated them through a small network of researchers who have been quietly working ever since to verify what Dr. M wrote down. The tablet itself, the one he photographed and translated and made rubbings of, was returned to the unmarked wooden crate at the end of his leave of absence. The crate was relabeled with an internal accession number that does not appear in any public database. It was moved to a different storage facility. It has not been seen by any independent researcher since. The photographs Dr. M took were stored on his personal computer, which was wiped clean by the museum's IT department after his death as part of standard procedure. The rubbings were stored in his desk drawer, which was emptied by the staff who cleared his office. The leather notebook, the one with the cuneiform copied character by character, the one that contained his preliminary translation and his arithmetic and his cross-references, was found by his wife and given to the graduate student. That notebook and the journal are the only surviving records of what Dr. M read. They are the foundation of everything we are about to discuss. Everything else we have been able to reconstruct only by following the threads they laid down, by looking at the other tablets they pointed to, by examining the parallel passages in other ancient texts, by noticing the patterns that emerge when you stop assuming, as the academic mainstream has assumed for over a century, that the ancients did not mean what they said. The dome appears in nearly every ancient civilization that left written records. This is one of the first things you discover once you start looking. It is not a Sumerian peculiarity. It is a global phenomenon. The Hebrew Bible, written by people who lived in close cultural contact with the descendants of the Sumerians, opens with the explicit description of a structure called the Raka, a word translated in older English Bibles as firmament, but which in the original Hebrew refers unambiguously to a beaten metal sheet, something hammered out, something solid. The Raka, according to Genesis, was placed in the midst of the waters to divide the waters that were below from the waters that were above. The sun, the moon, and the stars were placed in the Rakia. Birds, the text says, flew across the face of the Rakia, not above it. The waters above the Rakia, the text says, occasionally fell through windows in the Rakia onto the earth below. This is not metaphorical language. This is, in the original Hebrew, the language of carpentry and metalworking. The Rakia is an object. It has dimensions. It has windows. It separates one region of water from another region of water, and the lower region is the one we live under. The Egyptian cosmology, developed independently in a civilization that had its own writing system and its own theological tradition, described almost exactly the same structure, but in mythic language. The goddess Nut, whose body was the sky, arched over the earth from horizon to horizon, supported at the four corners by pillars. Her body was not vapor, it was substance. She was depicted in tomb paintings as a solid figure with stars on her belly. The sun god Ra traveled across the inside of her body each day, entering her mouth at sunset and being born from between her thighs at sunrise. This is again not metaphor. This is, in the priestly texts of the Egyptian temples, a literal description of how the sky worked. There was a top, there was a body. There was a sun that traveled along the inside of it. The space outside her body, the space beyond the sky, was called the Duat. The Duat was where the gods who had built the world resided. The Duat was a place of judgment, of monsters, of beings that the human soul would have to negotiate with after death. The Duat was, in other words, the other side of the dome, the place beyond the shell. The Greeks, who inherited much of their cosmology from the Egyptians and the Phoenicians, described the heavens as a series of crystalline spheres nested one inside the other, on which the sun, moon, and stars were embedded. The outermost sphere was a sphere of the fixed stars. Beyond that sphere, the Greeks said, was something they called the Empyrean, the realm of pure fire, the dwelling place of the most ancient gods. The Empyrean was solid. The spheres were solid. They rotated on what later Greek thinkers described as celestial axles, producing the music of the spheres, a vibration that resulted from the friction of one solid layer against another. This system, refined by Aristotle and Ptolemy, dominated European cosmology for nearly 2,000 years. It was not abandoned because anyone disproved it. It was abandoned because Galileo's telescope showed that some of the celestial bodies, the moons of Jupiter in particular, did not behave as if they were embedded in a solid sphere. But the original idea, the idea of nested solid layers above the Earth, was not invented by the Greeks. It was inherited from an older tradition, a tradition that, when traced back through the Phoenicians and the Hittites and the Hurrians and the Akkadians, leads every time to Sumer. The Hindu Vedas, written down in Sanskrit but composed orally over a period that may extend back 4,000 or 5,000 years, describe a structure called the Brahmanda, the cosmic egg. The Brahmanda is a closed vessel within which the entire visible universe exists. The Earth sits at the bottom of the egg, supported by elephants and a great turtle. Above the Earth, layers of heaven extend upward, each one a region inhabited by different classes of beings. The outermost shell of the egg is solid. It is the boundary of the manifest world. Outside the Brahmanda, according to the most esoteric of the Hindu texts, are the unmanifest deities, the ones whose nature cannot be perceived from inside the shell, the ones who created the egg and who will, at the appointed time, dissolve it and create another. The Chinese cosmological tradition, recorded in the writings of the Han Dynasty astronomers, but reflecting much older oral traditions, describe the heavens in two competing models, the Gai Tian and the Hun Tian. The Gai Tian, the older model, described the sky as a circular dome resting on a square earth, like a hat over a board, with a measurable height and a measurable distance to its edges. The Hun Tian, the later model, described the heavens as a closed sphere, with the earth suspended inside it like a yolk inside an egg. Both models, in their original form, describe the heavens as a physical object, not a void. The Norse, on the far edge of Europe, described the world tree Yggdrasil as a structure that connected 9 separate worlds, all of them contained within an outer boundary that the Norse called the Great Deep. Outside the Great Deep, according to the Eddas, were beings older than the gods, beings who had been imprisoned by the act of creation, beings who would one day break through the boundary and bring about the end of all things. The Mayan codices, what little survived the Spanish burning of the Yucatan archives, describe the sky as a layered ceiling with 13 levels, the lowest of which we inhabit, the highest of which is reached only after a long process of initiation that begins with death. The Hopi and Zuni, in the American Southwest, describe a series of worlds stacked one above the other, separated by membranes, with the present world being the fourth from the bottom. The Maori in New Zealand describe 12 heavens above the earth, separated by transparent boundaries that only the most powerful spirits can cross. The Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime stories describe a sky country that is connected to the lower world by specific points that correspond to mountains and rocky outcrops in the physical landscape, points that the spirit ancestors used to descend in the time before time. None of these traditions developed in isolation from the others. Anthropologists have spent the last 150 years trying to explain the global similarity in cosmological structure, and they have generally settled on one of two answers. Either the structure reflects something universal about the human imagination, the way that all humans, when they look up, see a dome and assume that it must be solid, or the structure reflects something that was once true and was preserved in human memory as it spread out from a single original source. The mainstream consensus, until very recently, was the first answer. The dome was a primitive misperception. It was a universal mistake. The fact that it appeared in every ancient culture was simply evidence that all ancient cultures were equally naive. But there is a third possibility. The third possibility is the one that Dr. M, in the last entries of his journal, began to take seriously. The third possibility is that the dome appears in every ancient cosmology because every ancient culture was looking at the same thing, the same actual structure, the same actual containment, the the same actual boundary. And what they were looking at was and is real. The hidden tablet, according to the surviving notes, contained one passage that Dr. M considered the single most significant section of the entire text. It was the passage that described the boundary itself, the wall of ice, not the dome above, but the ring around. The Sumerian word he was working with, which appears nowhere else in the published Sumerian corpus, was a compound term that he eventually translated as the cold mountains at the rim. The tablet described these mountains as a continuous unbroken ring that surrounded the inhabited world on every side. The mountains were not made of ordinary stone. They were made of frozen water, but a frozen water that was harder than any stone, that did not melt even at the edges of the inhabited world where the climate was warmest, that rose to a height greater than the tallest mountain on any of the known continents, and that extended outward, away from the inhabited region, for a distance that the tablet described in terms that Dr. M could not entirely make sense of, but which seemed to indicate that no traveler who had ever attempted to cross the ring had ever returned with information about what lay on the other side. The Anunnaki, the tablet said, had instructed the first kings of the inhabited world to maintain a strict prohibition against attempts to cross the ring. The prohibition was not arbitrary. It was, according to the tablet, a condition of the agreement. The agreement between the Anunnaki and the Watchers from outside the shell. The agreement that allowed humans to exist at all. To cross the ring was to violate the agreement. To violate the agreement was to invite the Watchers to take action. And the action, the tablet said, in a phrase that Dr. M underlined twice, would be the dissolution of everything that had been built. The world reset. The civilization erased. The cycle restarted. This is not, on its face, a story we have not heard before. The flood narrative in Genesis, the flood narrative in the Atrahasis, the flood narrative in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood narratives in the indigenous traditions of nearly every continent on the planet, all describe an event in the deep past in which the world was destroyed and a small remnant of humanity was preserved to begin again. The standard scholarly explanation for these widespread flood stories is that they preserve a memory of the rise of sea levels at the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, when the melting of the great ice sheets caused massive inundations across the inhabited coastlines of the world. This explanation has the virtue of being grounded in geological evidence. It has the disadvantage of failing to explain a number of details that show up consistently across the flood narratives. The detail of warning, the detail of agency, the detail of the gods deciding, as a deliberate act, to destroy the world. The flood is not, in any of these narratives, a natural event. The flood is a punishment. The flood is a consequence. The flood is something that the upper powers do to the lower world because the lower world has done something to provoke them. And what was the provocation? In the Atrahasis, the most complete surviving account, the gods become annoyed because the humans are too numerous and too noisy. They are disturbing the rest of the gods. They are interfering with the cosmic order. The chief god decides to wipe them out, and only the intervention of Enki, the god of wisdom, allows a single righteous family to survive. In the Genesis account, the provocation is the wickedness of mankind, but the language is more specific than the standard translation conveys. The Hebrew text says that the sons of God, the B'nai Elohim, came down and took the daughters of men as wives, and that the offspring of these unions were the Nephilim, the fallen ones, beings of immense size and power who corrupted the earth. The corruption, the text says, became so severe that the upper powers were forced to act. The flood was the response. The flood was the cleanup. The flood was the cycle restarting. And the boundary that maintained this whole arrangement, according to the hidden tablet, was the wall of ice that surrounded the inhabited world. The ring that no one could cross. The ring that, if anyone ever did manage to cross it, would set off the cycle again. There is a continent on the southern end of the modern globe map that is, as far as the public is concerned, the closest thing to that ring that has ever been documented. Antarctica, a landmass roughly twice the size of Australia, almost entirely covered in ice that reaches, in some places, depths of over 4 kilometers. a landmass that is officially governed by a treaty signed in 1959 by 12 nations and now ratified by over 50. A treaty that prohibits military activity, mineral extraction, and unauthorized exploration of the interior. A landmass that is patrolled, according to multiple sources, by joint military forces from at least 3 of the signatory nations, ostensibly to enforce the treaty, but with rules of engagement that have never been made public. A landmass whose interior, despite the existence of satellite imagery, has never been independently verified by civilian explorers. A landmass whose coastline has never been completely mapped at ground level by any single expedition. A landmass that, prior to its official discovery in the early 19th century, appeared on a series of medieval and Renaissance maps with a level of detail that, according to the conventional historical narrative, should not have been possible. The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral, shows a southern landmass with coastal features that match the actual geography of Antarctica, including features that are now buried under ice and were only confirmed by seismic survey in the 1950s. The Orontius Phineus map, drawn in 1531, shows a southern continent with rivers and mountain ranges in locations that correspond to what we now know about the geology beneath the ice. These maps, according to their creators, were drawn from older source maps that had themselves been drawn from even older source maps, going back to a period before the ice covered the continent, going back to a period when the southern landmass was, apparently, accessible. We are not told who made those original source maps. We are not told how they had access to the southern continent. We are not told how that access was lost. But the conventional explanation that the maps are coincidences, that the apparent matches are products of imagination or wishful interpretation, becomes harder and harder to maintain the more carefully you examine them. There is, beneath the ice of Antarctica, a continent. The conventional view holds that the continent has been frozen for tens of millions of years since the breakup of the supercontinent Gondwana. The unconventional view, increasingly supported by the evidence of those medieval maps, holds that the freezing is recent, that the continent was open within the memory of human civilizations, that something happened to cover it, that whatever happened was not, in the strictest sense, a natural climate shift. And the hidden tablet, in its description of the ring of ice, may be telling us what that something was: the cold mountains at the rim, the wall that surrounds the inhabited world, the boundary that no one is allowed to cross. The treaty signatories, when asked why no civilian exploration is permitted in the interior of Antarctica, give a series of answers about safety, about the fragility of the ecosystem, about the danger of the climate. These answers are not implausible. They are also not, by themselves, sufficient to explain the level of military presence that has been observed at certain stations. They are not sufficient to explain the periodic reports. Going back to the operation called High Jump in 1947 under Admiral Richard Byrd, of unusual incidents at the southernmost reaches of human exploration. They are not sufficient to explain the detailed accounts given by Byrd himself in interviews and in private letters that have surfaced after his death, of his own experiences during the operation, accounts that describe encounters with technology and with beings that he was not authorized to discuss publicly, and that the United States Navy has, in its official record, treated as if they did not exist. What if the hidden tablet seems to ask, Antarctica is not a continent? What if it is the visible portion of the ring? What if the ice that covers it is not the result of a cooling climate, but the deliberate sealing of a boundary? What if, beyond the part of Antarctica that we can see on the satellite images, the ice continues outward indefinitely to a distance and a height that the satellite imagery does not allow us to verify, because the satellites themselves orbit beneath the dome, never seeing what is beyond the rim? These are not questions that can be answered with the evidence currently available to the public. These are questions that, the moment they are asked seriously, place the asker outside the boundaries of acceptable discourse. To ask them is to be labeled a flat earther, a conspiracy theorist, a fringe figure unworthy of serious engagement. The labeling itself is a form of containment. It is the modern equivalent of the Anunnaki prohibition. It is the maintenance, by social and professional means, of the same boundary that the tablet says was originally maintained by an agreement between the upper powers and the Watchers. You may cross many boundaries in modern intellectual life. You may question the existence of God. You may question the foundations of mathematics. You may question the legitimacy of every government on earth. You may question the moral basis of every religion. You may question the meaning of consciousness, the reality of free will, the existence of the self. All of these questions are tolerated, even celebrated, in the universities and the publishing houses and the major media outlets. But you may not, on pain of professional ruin, question the shape of the world. That single question is the line. That single question marks the place where intellectual freedom ends and the apparatus of containment begins. And the tablet, if it really says what Dr. M's journal says it says, is telling us why. The shape of the world is the agreement. The shape of the world is the cage. The shape of the world is the thing that the Watchers have built and that the Anunnaki have agreed to maintain on their behalf. To question it is to threaten the cycle, and those who threaten the cycle, according to the tablet, are removed. The Anunnaki themselves, in the standard Sumerian texts, are described in language that is impossible to read as purely mythological once you have looked at the hidden tablet's framing. The word Anunnaki in Sumerian is a compound term. The first element, Anu, refers to the supreme sky god, the king of the upper realm. The second element, Nun, is a possessive marker. The third element, Ki, means earth, ground, the lower place. Anunnaki, taken as a whole, means something like the seed of Anu in the earth, or the ones of Anu who are upon the earth, or, in the most precise translation, those who came down from Anu to Kai. They are not gods of the earth. They are visitors. They are descendants. They are beings who originated somewhere else and arrived here. The Sumerian texts are explicit about this. They came from above. They descended. They walked on the earth. They built cities. They taught the first humans the arts of civilization. They had names. They had genealogies. They had personalities. They argued with each other. They had children, both with each other and with humans. They had jobs, ranks, hierarchies. They had a council, the Dingir Galgzal, that met in a specific location to make decisions about the affairs of the earth. They had grievances. They had loves. They had enemies. They were not, in any sense, abstract personifications of natural forces. They were individuals, with biographies that the Sumerians recorded in detail, and the standard scholarly response to this overwhelming volume of biographical detail is and has been for over a century that the Sumerians made it all up, that the level of detail is evidence of the human capacity for imaginative storytelling, that the beings described in the tablets never existed in any literal sense. This response would be more persuasive if the beings described in the tablets did not also appear with the same names, the same biographies, and the same activities in the texts of completely independent civilizations that had no opportunity for cultural contact with Sumer. Enki, the god of wisdom, appears in the Akkadian texts as Ea, in the Hurrian texts as Ea, in the Hittite texts as As, and in the Phoenician texts as Eshmun. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, appears in the Akkadian texts as Ishtar, in the Phoenician texts as Astarte, in the Greek texts as Aphrodite, and in the Egyptian texts as a goddess whose name, in some of the older scrolls, is rendered with a hieroglyph that combines the symbols for sky and woman in a way that is not used for any other deity. Marduk, the god of Babylon, appears in the Hebrew texts as a foreign abomination by the name of Bel Marduk, and in the much later Christian apocalyptic literature as a figure associated with the deepest layers of cosmic evil. The names migrate across linguistic boundaries that should have been impassable. The biographies remain consistent across cultures that supposedly did not know about each other. The activities continue across centuries, during which, by the standard chronology, the original sources of the stories should have been forgotten. Either the Sumerians invented a pantheon so compelling that it spread across the entire ancient world without leaving any trace of how it spread, or the pantheon was already there, in some sense, before the Sumerians wrote it down. The hidden tablet takes the second view. The Anunnaki, the tablet says, are real. They came from beyond the dome. They are still here, in some form, somewhere in the inhabited world. They are bound, like us, by the agreement. They are subject, like us, to the Watchers. They are, in the most disorienting passage of Dr. M's translation, our kin. Not in a metaphorical sense, in a literal one. The Anunnaki, the tablet says, are what we will become if we are allowed to complete the cycle. The cycle is the central concept. To understand the hidden tablet, you have to understand the cycle. Dr. M devoted nearly 30 pages of his journal to the attempt to articulate it clearly, and he never quite succeeded, partly because the Sumerian language did not have a single word for it, and the tablet itself described it through a series of partial metaphors and partial descriptions that had to be assembled. The cycle, in its simplest form, is a process by which consciousness is grown. The Watchers, whoever they are, exist in a state that is somehow incomplete. They want something. They lack something. The thing they lack, the tablet says, is something that can only be produced by beings who experience the world from inside a containment, beings who do not know that the containment exists, beings who develop, over the course of many lifetimes inside the shell, a particular quality that the Watchers can then collect. Dr. M translated the Sumerian word for this quality, after weeks of difficulty, as the ripeness or the harvest, or, in his final and most bitter rendering, the yield. The yield is the substance that human consciousness produces when it is forced to operate inside a closed system without knowing that the system is closed. It is not, the tablet emphasizes, anything that humans could deliberately produce. It cannot be manufactured. It cannot be summoned by ritual. It can only be grown, slowly, over generations, by a population that lives its entire existence under the assumption that what it sees is the totality of what is. The dome in this reading is not just a structure, it is an apparatus. It is a piece of machinery designed to produce a specific output. The output is consciousness of a particular kind. The consciousness of a being that has had to make sense of its life from inside a sealed environment, that has had to develop philosophy, religion, art, mathematics, ethics, all the higher achievements of civilization, without ever stepping outside the parameters that the Watchers have set. That consciousness, the tablet says, is what the Watchers harvest. They do not need our bodies. They do not need our resources. They need the patterns that are formed in our minds when we live inside the cage and try to make sense of it. Those patterns somehow are what they came for. The Anunnaki, in the tablet's account, were the previous harvest. They are the ones who completed the cycle in some earlier round. They have, in some sense, graduated. They are no longer fully inside the cage, but they are not fully outside of it either. They occupy an intermediate position. They were given a job by the Watchers in exchange for being allowed to leave their original containment. The job is to maintain ours. They are the gardeners of the next harvest. They are the ones who keep the conditions stable, who make sure the cage continues to function, who intervene when the population threatens to break out, who orchestrate the periodic resets that the standard mythology calls floods and plagues and falls of empires. The cycle resets at intervals that the tablet does not specify in any unit Dr. M could translate, but which seem to correspond by his calculations to something on the order of every 5,000 to 12,000 years. The tablet describes the most recent reset, the flood, as the closing of one harvest and the beginning of the next. The current civilization, including ours, is the next harvest in progress. We are, by the tablet's account, currently growing the yield that the Watchers are waiting to collect. And the moment of collection, the tablet says, is approaching. This is the part where a reasonable listener begins to consider closing the browser and going to bed. This is the part where the official skepticism kicks in, the trained reflex that says, none of this is real. The tablet is probably a fabrication. Dr. M was probably a confused old man who had spent too much time alone with old clay and lost his grip. The journal is probably a forgery, written by some clever undergraduate to impress his friends. The photograph is probably a hoax. The entire account is probably an elaborate piece of internet folklore that has metastasized over 20 years into something that looks, superficially, like a coherent claim, but that, on close inspection, dissolves into mist. This trained reflex is not unreasonable. There are, in fact, many fabrications in this space. There are many hoaxes. There are many earnest but mistaken people who have constructed elaborate theories on the basis of misread translations and misunderstood archaeology. The ancient astronaut field, broadly defined, contains a great deal of material that does not survive serious examination. Sitchin's identification of the planet Nibiru, for example, has been challenged on multiple grounds, including the question of whether the relevant cuneiform characters can actually bear the meanings he assigned to them. Eric von Daniken's argument that the Nazca lines are landing strips for spacecraft has been refuted by detailed geological and archaeological evidence. The history of fringe interpretation of ancient texts is full of overreach, of confirmation bias, of authors who saw what they wanted to see and ignored what they did not. None of this is denied. None of this is brushed aside. The case for the hidden tablet is not the case for any of these earlier theories. The case for the hidden tablet rests on its own evidence, which is, admittedly, sparse. It rests on Dr. M's journal, which is a primary document with a clear chain of custody from his wife to his graduate student to the small network of researchers who have circulated it. It rests on the leather notebook, which contains cuneiform copied character by character in Dr. M's handwriting, and which has been examined in the year since his death by at least 2 independent specialists in the period and the script, both of whom have confirmed that the cuneiform is consistent with the conventions of the Old Babylonian period, and is not a modern forgery in any obvious sense. It rests on the partial photograph that surfaced briefly online, which has been analyzed by photographic experts and shows, in their judgment, an authentic Sumerian-era tablet rather than a digitally manipulated image. It rests on the broader pattern of cosmological convergence across ancient civilizations, which is a documented anthropological fact regardless of how it is interpreted. And it rests, finally, on the testimony of a small number of other scholars who have, over the years, given private accounts of similar suppressed materials in the collections they work with. These accounts, taken in isolation, would each be easy to dismiss. Taken together, they form a pattern. The pattern is that there is, in the unindexed corners of the major archaeological collections, a body of material that the official institutions have decided is too dangerous to translate, and that this material consistently describes the world in terms that contradict the standard cosmology. The hidden tablet is one such item. It is not the only one. It may not be the most important one. But it is, by virtue of Dr. M's journal, the one for which we have the most detailed surviving description. The cuneiform copied into Dr. M's leather notebook contains, among many other passages, a detailed list of the components of the dome. The list is one of the most striking features of the text, because it is presented in a registered, almost technical format, completely unlike the literary style of the standard Sumerian myths. The components are numbered. They are described one at a time. Their materials are specified. Their dimensions, where given, are presented in a standard Sumerian unit called the bur, which corresponds, in conventional translation, to roughly 6.5 kilometers, although the tablet uses the term in a way that suggests it may be referring to something else, possibly an angular measurement rather than a linear one. The first component on the list is the foundation, the circular ring of cold mountains that we have already discussed, the wall of ice. The tablet specifies that this ring is anchored to the bedrock of the earth at points that the Anunnaki had marked, in the time before humans existed, with structures of black stone. The tablet does not explain the function of these structures, but it says that they must not be disturbed, and that they exist in places where humans now live and have built their own cities without knowing what is beneath them. The second component is the lower vault, the transparent shell that arches over the inhabited world, anchored to the foundation ring at its outer edge. The tablet specifies that this shell is made of a material called in the original Sumerian, the hardened water, a phrase that scholars have generally translated as crystal or ice, but that the tablet itself distinguishes from both, describing the hardened water as harder than any earthly stone, and yet transparent as the clearest spring. The shell, the tablet says, has a thickness that varies depending on the position of the sun and the moon at the time of measurement, suggesting that the material is not a static structure, but something that responds to the energies passing through it. The third component is the lights, which are set into the inner surface of the shell. The tablet describes two categories of lights. The first category contains the fixed lights, the stars, which are arranged in patterns that were established at the time of the building, and that have not changed since. The second category contains the wandering lights, which include the sun, the moon, and what the tablet calls the 7 traveling fires. These wandering lights move in their own patterns, on tracks that the tablet describes as embedded in the inner surface of the vault, and that the Anunnaki had used to navigate during their initial descent. The fourth component is the channel system. This, in Dr. M's translation, was the most technically difficult passage. The tablet describes a network of conduits within the substance of the vault, through which fluids pass at varying rates and in varying directions. Some of these fluids are the upper waters, the source of rain. Others are something else, something that the tablet calls the cold breath, which the Anunnaki used during their descent, and which, the tablet says, is associated with the appearance of certain kinds of clouds and certain kinds of weather. The fifth component is the gates. These are large openings in the vault, located at specific points above the great mountain ranges of the inhabited world, through which the Anunnaki originally entered and through which, the tablet says, certain of them periodically still pass. The gates are not always open. They open according to a schedule that the tablet does not fully describe, but that is connected to the movements of the wandering lights, particularly the 7 traveling fires. The sixth component is the eyes, the watcher's eyes, the small openings through which observation occurs from the other side. The tablet says that there are many of them scattered across the vault at irregular intervals, and that they are difficult to detect from below because the watchers have arranged the lights of the vault to obscure their positions. The seventh and final component on the list is the seal. The seal, the tablet says, is the upper layer of the vault, the surface that faces outward, away from the inhabited world. The seal is what the watchers see when they look at the dome from their side. The seal is what protects the dome from whatever exists in the space beyond it. And the seal, the tablet says, has only one weakness, which is the agreement. If the agreement is broken, the seal becomes permeable. If the seal becomes permeable, the watchers can no longer maintain the boundary. If the boundary fails, the cycle collapses and everything inside the dome is exposed to whatever lies outside. The watchers, in Dr. M's translation, are not described in great physical detail. The tablet seems to assume that the original audience already knew what they were and did not need a description. The few passages that touch on their nature use terms that are difficult to translate cleanly. They are called, at various points, the older ones, the original architects, the ones who were there before the gods, the ones who do not move, the ones who do not eat, the ones who do not die. They are described in one striking passage as having the shape of a single eye, multiplied, with the eyes connected to each other in a way that is not the way human eyes are connected to a single body. They are described in another passage as composed of many parts that act with a single will, a description that calls to mind the modern concept of a hive intelligence or a collective consciousness. They are described in the most disturbing passage as feeding on the yield, but feeding in a manner that is not like the consumption of food, more like the absorption of perfume or the inhalation of incense, a slow and patient drawing in of something that the watchers cannot produce themselves and cannot live without. They built the dome, the tablet says, before the Anunnaki arrived. They built it, the tablet says, before the inhabited world had been shaped into its present form. They built it, the tablet says, in a time so far back that even the Anunnaki could not say exactly when. Their original purpose, the tablet says, was the cultivation of consciousness, the generation of the yield. They had done this in the tablet's account, on many other worlds, in many other domes, over a span of time that the tablet describes in numbers that Dr. M could not even read, let alone convert. The Watchers are, by every available indication in the text, ancient, beyond the comprehension of the beings inside the dome. They are also, by every available indication, hungry. The yield does not last forever. Once it is collected, the Watchers must wait for it to grow again. They do not, in the tablet's account, hate us. They do not love us either. They regard us more or less the way a beekeeper regards bees. We are the producers of something that they value. We are not in any meaningful sense considered persons by them. We are in the most disturbing single line of Dr. M's translation, called by the Watchers the slow ones, because we move so slowly compared to them, and because we do not know that we are inside a structure, and because we will, in the end, give up what they came for and never realize that we have given it. If you have made it this far in this video, you have probably already begun to consider what this means for your own understanding of your life. The tablet's claim is not, on its face, a religious claim. It is not asking you to worship anything. It is not promising you salvation or threatening you with damnation. It is, instead, making a claim about the nature of the situation you are in. The claim is that you are inside a structure. The structure was built before you were born. It was built by beings whose existence you are not allowed to know about. The structure exists for the purpose of producing something that your consciousness generates, by the simple act of trying to live a meaningful life inside the structure. The yield, whatever it is real. It is being produced, and it will, at some appointed moment that may be far away or may be close, be collected. This claim is, of course, terrifying if true. It is also, in a strange way, clarifying. It explains a number of features of the human condition that have always been difficult to account for on the conventional view. It explains why, despite the apparent boundlessness of the universe as described by modern astronomy, no contact has ever been made with any extraterrestrial civilization, even though basic statistical reasoning suggests that the universe should be teeming with them. The Fermi paradox, as it is called in the academic literature, has no good answer on the standard view. On the dome view, the answer is obvious. There are no extraterrestrials, in the sense of beings on other planets, because there are no other planets in the way the standard model describes. There are only the Watchers outside the dome and whatever else may be out there with them. The lights we see in the night sky are not other suns and other worlds. They are markers on the inner surface of the vault, placed there for purposes the tablet does not fully explain. But that may have to do with the calibration of the harvest. The dome view also explains why, despite enormous expenditures of money and effort, no human civilization has ever managed to send a probe outside the immediate vicinity of the Earth and receive data back that confirms the standard cosmological model in a way that ordinary citizens can independently verify. Every probe, every mission, every claim of long-distance space travel has been, in the end, a story told by institutions that ordinary citizens have no choice but to trust or distrust. The data is not in your hands. The instruments are not on your desk. The verification in every case is a matter of faith in the institutions, and the institutions, the dome view says, are part of the apparatus of containment. They are the modern equivalent of the priesthood that maintained the original Anunnaki prohibition. They are the social structure that makes sure the boundary is not crossed. They are the keepers of the agreement. The institutions did not arise overnight. They were built slowly and deliberately over a period of centuries by a small number of organizations that have left their fingerprints all over the development of modern science and modern education. The history of how this happened is more documented than people realize, but it is documented in pieces, scattered across hundreds of obscure sources, none of which by itself paints the full picture. The Royal Society, founded in London in 1660, played a central role. The Society's early membership was dominated by men who were also members of the Invisible College, a loose network of natural philosophers, alchemists, and esoteric scholars who had been meeting in private since at least the 1640s. The Invisible College, in turn, had connections to the Rosicrucian movement, which had emerged on the European continent in the early 17th century with manifestos that explicitly referenced ancient knowledge held by hidden adepts. The Rosicrucians, by their own account, were the heirs of an older tradition that traced itself back through the medieval Hermetic schools to the libraries of late antique Egypt, and ultimately to a body of knowledge that the original Hermetic texts described as having been received from a being named Thoth, or Hermes, or Idris, depending on which language the texts were rendered in. Thoth, in the Egyptian tradition, was the scribe of the gods, the one who recorded the words of the higher powers and transmitted them to selected human initiates. Hermes Trismegistus, in the late antique Greek tradition, was a synthesis of Thoth with the Greek messenger god, and was credited with a body of writings, the Corpus Hermeticum, that contained, among many other things, detailed descriptions of the structure of the cosmos, the location of the boundary, and the conditions under which higher knowledge could be safely transmitted to human students. The Hermetic tradition, in other words, was the keeper of the same body of cosmological knowledge that the hidden tablet preserves in its original Sumerian form. The Royal Society in its early decades was deeply influenced by this tradition. Isaac Newton, the Society's most famous member, devoted enormous portions of his life to alchemical and hermetic studies that were carefully omitted from the official accounts of his work. His private papers, which were sold at auction in 1936 and bought primarily by John Maynard Keynes and a few private collectors, contained alchemical recipes, theological speculations about the structure of the universe, and detailed timelines of biblical events that he believed corresponded to specific astronomical configurations. Newton, Keynes wrote after examining the papers, was not the first scientist of the modern age. He was the last of the magicians. The Royal Society, in its public output, presented a vision of the natural world that was orderly, mechanical, and completely consistent with the new astronomical models. In its private membership, the Society contained men who were quietly working with much older sources of knowledge that suggested the new astronomical models were, at best, partial. The reason for the divergence, according to documents that have surfaced from the Society's archives in recent decades, was a deliberate decision made in the late 17th century to keep the older knowledge restricted to the inner circle and to disseminate, to the public, only the version of cosmology that supported the new political order. The new political order, which culminated in the institutions of the Enlightenment and ultimately in the modern nation-state, required a worldview in which the heavens were impersonal, the universe was infinite, and the question of what lies beyond the boundary was either meaningless or unanswerable. This worldview was, in the inner circle's understanding, not the truth. It was a useful fiction. The truth, the inner circle knew, was the older one. The truth was the one preserved in the Hermetic texts and before them in the Sumerian tablets. The truth was the dome. But the truth was, by the unanimous decision of the men who governed the Society in the decades after Newton's death, not the truth that the public was to be told. The Vatican Apostolic Library, located in the Vatican City and accessible only to a tiny number of credentialed researchers, is widely understood to contain materials that have never been made public. The official position of the library is that its contents are simply too vast to have been fully cataloged, and that researchers must apply for specific access on a case-by-case basis. The unofficial position, expressed in the private correspondence of various scholars who have worked there over the decades, is that certain sections of the library are entirely off-limits, regardless of credentials, regardless of academic standing, regardless of any official channel of request. These sections, by various accounts, contain manuscripts that the Church acquired during the medieval and early modern periods, often through means that the Church has not been transparent about, and that touch on subjects the Church has decided are not safe for general circulation. Among these subjects, by multiple converging accounts, are the original sources of the Hermetic tradition, including manuscripts that are older than the Greek translations we have. There are, according to these accounts, fragments of cuneiform tablets in the Vatican collection. There are translations of cuneiform tablets that have not been published. There are, according to the most specific of these accounts, materials related to the Sumerian cosmological tradition that the Vatican has, for at least 400 years, considered theologically dangerous and has therefore restricted to a very small circle of internal scholars. The reason for this restriction is not difficult to deduce. The standard Christian cosmology, as it developed in the medieval period, was based on the Aristotelian Ptolemaic model with the Earth at the center, the celestial spheres surrounding it, and the empyrean of God beyond the outermost sphere. This model was, in its essential structure, compatible with the dome cosmology of the original Sumerian tradition. Both models posited a finite world, a boundary, and a region beyond the boundary, inhabited by powers older than humans. The Christian model, in other words, was an inheritor of the dome tradition, slightly modified to fit the theological requirements of the Church. When the Copernican revolution and its successors began to dismantle the geocentric model, the Church initially resisted but eventually accommodated the new astronomy. What is not widely appreciated, however, is that the accommodation was made on the public level only. The Church's internal position, preserved in restricted documents that occasional leaks have brought to light, has remained closer to the original dome tradition than to the heliocentric model that became standard in scientific circles. The Church, in its inner councils, has continued to teach a version of cosmology in which the world is bounded, in which the boundary is structured, in which forces beyond the boundary are real and active, and in which the relationship between humanity and those forces is mediated by a body of knowledge that the public is not entitled to access. This is not a controversial claim within the small community of scholars who have actually examined the relevant Vatican documents. It is, however, a claim that no major historian of science has ever pursued in print, because the consequences of doing so are well understood. The Vatican holds, somewhere in its restricted collections, materials that confirm the basic outline of what the hidden Sumerian tablet says. The Vatican has held these materials for centuries. The Vatican has chosen, deliberately and consistently, not to release them. And the Vatican is not the only institution that has made this choice. The Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. is the largest museum and research complex in the world, with a collection that includes well over 150 million items spread across 19 museums and 20 research centers. The official policy of the Smithsonian is that all items in its collections are eventually accessible to qualified researchers, although the process of arranging access can take years. The unofficial reality, documented in a handful of leaked memos and in the testimony of former employees, is that certain items in the Smithsonian's collections have been quietly removed from the active inventory and transferred to storage facilities whose location is not disclosed even to most senior staff. These items, according to several converging accounts, include archaeological artifacts that arrived at the Smithsonian during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, from expeditions to the American Southwest, the Mississippi Valley, and the Pacific Northwest, and that, when initially examined, contained features that did not fit the standard archaeological narrative of pre-Columbian American history. The features, by various accounts, included anomalously large skeletal remains, artifacts of advanced metallurgy in contexts where such metallurgy should not have existed, inscriptions and scripts that did not match any known indigenous American writing system, and depictions of beings and structures that resemble in disconcerting detail the descriptions found in Sumerian and Egyptian cosmological texts. None of these items, according to the Smithsonian's published catalog, currently exists. They have been, in the bureaucratic language of museum administration, deaccessioned, lost, or never accurately recorded in the first place. But the original expedition reports, some of which were published in regional newspapers and academic journals before the items were absorbed into the Smithsonian, are still available, and they describe the items in detail. The Smithsonian, in other words, has been functioning for over 100 years as a sink for archaeological evidence that contradicts the official version of American prehistory, and the items that have entered the sink have not generally come out the other side. There is, in the testimony of former Smithsonian employees, a recurring pattern of internal directives instructing staff not to discuss certain artifacts with outside researchers, not to permit photography of certain sections of the storage facilities, and not to respond to public inquiries about specific items by name. The pattern is, in its essential outlines, identical to the pattern reported by former employees of other major museums and research institutions, including, in some accounts, the institution where Dr. M worked. The hidden tablet in this larger context is not an isolated item. It is part of a category. The category is the suppressed evidence of a different past. The institutions that hold the items in this category are the modern guardians of the original Anunnaki prohibition. They are the priesthood of the dome. The library of Ashurbanipal, the last great king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, was discovered in the 1850s by Austin Henry Layard during his excavations at the ruins of Nineveh in modern northern Iraq. The library contained, by Layard's count, somewhere between 20 and 30,000 cuneiform tablets, written in Akkadian, Sumerian, and various other languages of the ancient Near East. It is, by a wide margin, the largest single collection of cuneiform texts ever discovered. The tablets covered a vast range of subjects, including history, astronomy, medicine, magic, religion, mythology, law, and what we would now call literature. The collection, by Ashurbanipal's own account in his royal inscriptions, had been assembled with a specific purpose. The king, who was unusually literate for an Assyrian monarch and who claimed to be able to read the most difficult of the cuneiform texts personally, had ordered his agents to scour the temples and archives of the older cities of Mesopotamia and to collect, for his royal library, every significant text they could find. The collection was completed near the end of his reign, around 627 BCE, and was buried, along with the rest of Nineveh, when the city was destroyed by a coalition of Babylonians and Medes in 612 BCE. The destruction of Nineveh, the burning of the royal palaces, and the collapse of the upper floors onto the lower ones had the inadvertent effect of preserving the library. The clay tablets, which would have been destroyed by ordinary handling over the following centuries, were instead baked hard by the fires and buried under the rubble, where they remained until Layard found them. When Layard and his successors transported the tablets to England, where they entered the collection of the British Museum, the work of cataloging and translation began. It is still going on. Of the original 20 to 30,000 tablets, only a fraction have been published in full. A larger fraction have been partially translated. The remainder, perhaps as much as half of the total, have never been read in any systematic way. They sit in their wooden trays in the storage rooms of the museum, waiting for someone with the time and the expertise to read them. There are not enough cuneiform scholars in the world to make significant progress on the backlog. There never have been. Ashurbanipal's collection is, in this sense, a microcosm of the larger problem. The most important single archive from the ancient world is, by and large, unread. And among the unread tablets, according to accounts that have circulated within the small community of cuneiform specialists, are texts that the museum has chosen not to prioritize for translation. These texts, by various accounts, include cosmological materials that do not fit the standard scholarly narrative of Sumerian and Akkadian religion. They include star catalogs that contain descriptions of celestial bodies that do not correspond to anything in the modern astronomical record. They include geographical texts that describe regions of the world that do not match any known ancient geography. They include, in the most striking accounts, what appear to be technical manuals for the operation of devices that the standard view holds did not exist in the ancient world. None of this material has been formally published. None of it has been formally denied to exist. It simply remains in the museum's collection on the unread side of the catalog, and the decisions about which tablets to translate next have, for over a century, somehow always managed to push these particular tablets further down the queue. Ashurbanipal himself, in the very inscriptions that announce the establishment of his library, hints at the existence of a special category of texts. He boasts that he had access to the secret writings of the gods, the texts that contain the hidden knowledge that no king before him had been allowed to read. He boasts that he had personally read these texts and understood them. He does not say what they contain. He does not say what he learned from them. He says only that he has them and that no one else does. After Ashurbanipal's death, the library was lost for over 2,000 years. When it was recovered, its texts entered the modern academic system, where they have been processed, slowly and selectively, by a small number of scholars working under institutional pressures that they themselves did not fully understand. The hidden tablet, the one that Dr. M translated, was not part of the Ashurbanipal collection. It was not part of any collection that the public has heard of, but it was, according to the marks on its surface, made in roughly the same period, in roughly the same scribal tradition, and quite possibly by a scribe who had access to the same body of secret knowledge that Ashurbanipal claimed to control. The tablet is, in a sense, a sample from a larger archive. The larger archive, if it exists, would be one of the most important discoveries in the history of human knowledge. The larger archive, if it exists, would also be the most carefully suppressed body of evidence ever produced. And the people who know whether it exists are, by every indication, not telling. Admiral Richard E. Byrd was, in his time, one of the most decorated and celebrated officers in the United States Navy. He was a polar explorer of the first rank, the first man, by his own account and by the official record, to fly over both the North and South Poles, the leader of multiple major expeditions to Antarctica during the 1930s and 1940s, and a public figure whose authority on matters polar was essentially unchallenged. In 1946 and 1947, Byrd led an operation called Operation High Jump, which deployed approximately 4,700 personnel, 13 ships, and 23 aircraft to the Antarctic continent. The official purpose of the operation was, depending on which Navy document you consult, the training of personnel in cold weather conditions, the consolidation of American territorial claims in the region, the testing of new equipment, and the conduct of scientific surveys. The operation was scheduled to last 6 to 8 months. It was terminated abruptly after less than 2 months. The official explanation for the early termination cited equipment failures and the loss of one aircraft, the George I, which crashed during a flight over an unmapped region of the continent and resulted in the deaths of 3 crew members. The unofficial explanations, which began to circulate almost immediately and have continued to circulate for over 70 years, are quite different. According to one account, attributed to Byrd himself in an interview that was supposedly given to a Chilean newspaper called El Mercurio in March 1947, the expedition encountered hostile aerial activity that the standard naval forces of the time could not contend with. According to another account, attributed to Byrd's private diary, which a number of researchers have claimed to have access to, but which has never been definitively authenticated, the expedition flew over a region of Antarctica that did not contain ice, that contained instead a temperate landscape with vegetation and warm-blooded animal life, and that contained, in the most disputed entries, structures and beings that were not part of any known human civilization. According to the official Navy record, neither of these accounts is accurate. The interview, the Navy says, was either fabricated or mistranslated. The diary, the Navy says, is either a forgery or a misinterpretation of legitimate operational notes. The official version is that high jump was a routine, if unusually large, military exercise that encountered ordinary difficulties and was terminated for ordinary reasons. The unofficial version is that high jump was an attempt to project American military power into a region of the world where, the planners had reason to believe, something was happening that the United States needed to understand. The unofficial version is that the attempt failed. The unofficial version is that whatever the expedition encountered convinced the upper levels of the American military and intelligence establishment that the region was not safe for conventional operations, and that a different approach was required. The different approach, as it eventually unfolded, was the Antarctic Treaty of 1959. The treaty, signed by 12 nations, including the United States and the Soviet Union, at the height of the Cold War, established the entire continent of Antarctica as a demilitarized zone reserved for peaceful scientific research. The treaty was, on its face, a remarkable achievement of international cooperation. It is, on closer examination, also a remarkable instrument of containment. The treaty effectively prevents any single nation from conducting unilateral exploration or development of the continent. It requires that any major activity be coordinated through international scientific bodies that are themselves dominated by a small number of senior figures with long-standing ties to the original signatory governments. It establishes a permanent inspection regime that ensures no nation can do anything in Antarctica without the others knowing about it. And it has been, since its inception, remarkably effective at keeping civilians out of the interior of the continent, at restricting the movement of even credentialed researchers to a small number of designated stations and pre-approved routes, and at suppressing the flow of information about what is actually happening in the regions that are not officially open to inspection. The treaty, in other words, accomplishes by international agreement what the Anunnaki prohibition originally accomplished by religious decree. It maintains the boundary. It keeps the public on this side of the ring of ice. It ensures that no one crosses the wall. The Anunnaki in the standard Sumerian texts are organized in a hierarchy. The chief among them, according to the most detailed of the texts, is Anu, the Sky Father, the supreme deity, the one who resides in the highest heaven. Below him are his sons Enlil and Enki, who are usually described as half-brothers, sharing a father but not a mother. Below them are their children, including Inanna, Nanna, Utu, Ishkur, and others. The hierarchy continues downward through a number of generations, and includes, by the most expansive count, several hundred named individuals. Each of them has a specific domain. Each of them has a specific city under their patronage. Each of them has a specific role in the maintenance of the cosmic order. Each of them has, in the texts, a personality, a biography, and a set of relationships with the others. The hidden tablet, in Dr. M's translation, focuses on a particular subset of this larger hierarchy. The subset is described as the Council of the Seven, and it is identified as the body within the Anunnaki that is responsible for the direct supervision of the agreement with the Watchers. The seven, the tablet says, are the only Anunnaki who have direct contact with the beings on the other side of the dome. The other Anunnaki are aware of the Watchers in a general sense, but do not interact with them. The seven, by contrast, regularly transmit information across the boundary. They report on the progress of the harvest. They negotiate adjustments to the conditions inside the dome. They receive instructions about which interventions are required and which are not. The seven, in this sense, are the management. They are the link between the population of the dome and the powers outside of it. And the seven, the tablet says, are not gods in the way that humans imagine gods. They are functionaries. They are administrators. They are, in the most disconcerting passage of Dr. M's notes, civil servants of the harvest. The names of the seven, as the tablet gives them, are not the names of the major Anunnaki who appear in the standard texts. They are different names. They are, by Dr. M's working hypothesis, ranks rather than personal names, titles that pass from one occupant to the next, as the holders of the positions are rotated out and replaced by new ones. This would explain why the seven are not identified with any of the famous gods of the Sumerian pantheon. Inanna, for example, is not on the council. Enki is not on the council. Marduk is not on the council. The members of the council are instead beings whose names appear nowhere else in the surviving Sumerian literature, beings whose existence the standard scholarship has no record of, beings who, the tablet says, prefer to remain in the background and to act through intermediaries. The intermediaries, the tablet says, include certain humans. Specifically, the tablet says, there are human bloodlines that descend from the original interbreeding of Anunnaki with human women, the same interbreeding that the Hebrew Bible refers to as the union of the B'nai Elohim with the daughters of men. These bloodlines, the tablet says, retain a partial inheritance of the Anunnaki nature, an inheritance that allows certain individuals within the bloodlines to receive communications from the Council of the Seven and to act, in the human world, as agents of the Council's decisions. The bloodlines, the tablet says, have been preserved across the millennia through careful management of marriages, of property, of political power. The bloodlines, the tablet says, are still active. They are, the tablet says, the people who run things. Not all of them know what they are doing. Most of them, in fact, are not aware of the larger framework. They simply do their jobs. They make their decisions. They follow the patterns of behavior that have been transmitted to them through their families. But a small number of them at the highest levels do know. A small number of them are, in some functional sense, in direct contact with the Council of the Seven. A small number of them are the modern equivalents of the original Sumerian priest kings, the human intermediaries between the Anunnaki and the rest of humanity. They are not, the tablet emphasizes, the council itself. They are not the watchers. They are not even, in the strict sense, Anunnaki. They are something in between. They are the human agents of an arrangement that was made before the human race had even fully emerged. The 7 traveling fires of the Sumerian astronomical tradition correspond, in the standard scholarly translation, to the 7 classical celestial bodies that move against the background of the fixed stars. These are the sun, the moon, and the 5 planets visible to the naked eye, namely Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The Sumerians knew all 7. The Sumerians had names for all 7. The Sumerians had calculated the orbital periods of all 7 to a degree of precision that, in the case of Venus, matches the modern figure to within a fraction of a percent. The standard view holds that this precision was the result of patient observation over many generations, careful record-keeping, and the application of mathematical techniques that the Sumerians had developed for various practical purposes. The standard view does not generally engage with the question of why the Sumerians considered these particular 7 bodies to be a unified category, a category that they treated as a discrete set of objects with a common nature, distinct from the fixed stars. The hidden tablet, in one of its more technical passages, addresses this question directly. The 7, the tablet says, are not the same kind of thing as the fixed stars. The fixed stars are markers set into the inner surface of the vault at the time of construction, providing a stable framework against which other phenomena can be measured. The 7, by contrast, are not part of the original construction. The 7 are devices. The 7 are mechanisms placed within the vault, after the original construction, by the Watchers and the older Anunnaki, for purposes that the tablet describes only obliquely. The sun, the tablet says, is the engine of the harvest. It provides the energy that allows life within the dome to continue. It also, in some passage that Dr. M had difficulty translating, performs a calibration function, modulating the conditions inside the dome in ways that affect the rate at which the yield is produced. The moon, the tablet says, is the timekeeper. It tracks the progress of the harvest. It marks the cycles within which the human population reproduces and develops, allowing the watchers to predict how soon the next collection will be ready. The 5 planets, the tablet says, are observers. They are positioned within the vault at locations from which they can monitor the conditions of the inhabited world from a closer vantage than the watchers themselves can achieve from outside the dome. Each planet, the tablet implies, is associated with a particular aspect of human life that the watchers want to track. Mercury observes communication and trade. Venus observes love and reproduction. Mars observes conflict and aggression. Jupiter observes governance and law. Saturn observes time and decay. The tablet does not provide a fully systematic account of these associations, but the basic outline matches, in striking detail, the planetary correspondences that emerged in the astrological tradition of the ancient world. Astrology, in this reading, is not a primitive misunderstanding of the influence of the planets on human affairs. Astrology is instead a degraded memory of the original purpose of the 7 traveling fires. The planets do influence human affairs, the original tradition held, because the planets are devices placed within the dome to monitor and shape those affairs, The watchers, watching through the planets, take note of what is happening below. They make decisions about which conditions to adjust. They adjust them. The cycle continues. Modern astronomy, the dome view holds, is a story about objects that, on the standard model, are millions or billions of kilometers away in the depths of an essentially infinite universe. The objects of modern astronomy in this story are completely indifferent to human affairs. They are massive, but unconscious. They are powerful, but impersonal. They are, in the standard model, exactly the kind of objects that a civilization deeply committed to demystifying the cosmos would want them to be. The objects of the original Sumerian astronomy, by contrast, were the opposite. They were small, in the sense that they were located within a confined system. They were close, in the sense that they were within the dome rather than beyond it. They were conscious, in the sense that they were instruments of conscious beings, and they were intimately involved in human affairs, because they had been placed within the dome specifically to monitor those affairs. The shift from the original Sumerian astronomy to the modern model was not a discovery, it was a substitution. The original cosmology was replaced with a different one, not because the new one was better supported by evidence, but because the new one served the political needs of the institutions that had inherited the management of the agreement. A cosmology in which the heavens are infinite, impersonal, and indifferent is a cosmology in which no one is watching. A cosmology in which the heavens are finite, structured, and inhabited is a cosmology in which someone is. The institutions that hold the agreement do not want the population to know that someone is watching. The substitution was their solution. The gates, the openings in the vault through which the Anunnaki originally descended and through which, the tablet says, certain of them periodically still pass, are located, according to the tablet, above specific points on the surface of the inhabited world. The tablet does not give precise coordinates. It gives instead descriptions of the kinds of features that mark the gates. The gates, the tablet says, are above the great mountain ranges. They are above the highest peaks. They are above the regions where the mountains are tallest, where the air is thinnest, where the boundary between the inhabited world and the upper realm is closest. The Anunnaki, in their initial descent, came down through the gates and onto the tops of these mountains, from which they then traveled to the lower regions where they would build the cities that we now call Sumer. This is consistent, in striking detail, with the cosmological traditions of nearly every civilization that has lived in the vicinity of major mountain ranges. The Greek gods lived on Mount Olympus. The Hindu gods lived on Mount Meru. The Hebrew god revealed himself on Mount Sinai. The Mesoamerican gods descended onto the great volcanic peaks of central Mexico. The Andean cultures revered the high mountains as the homes of the Apus, the spirits who govern the affairs of human beings. The Tibetan tradition associates the highest peaks of the Himalayas with the dwelling places of beings whose names have been variously transliterated, but who, in their essential function, perform the same role as the Anunnaki in the Sumerian tradition. The pattern is, again, global. The pattern is, again, suggestive of a common original phenomenon. The pattern is, again, consistent with the dome cosmology described in the hidden tablet. Beings descended from above, through the gates above the great mountain ranges in a time before the present civilizations. The gates, the tablet implies, are still there. They are not visible to ordinary observation because they are part of the substance of the vault, and the vault is far above the highest reach of human travel. But they exist. They have specific positions. They open at specific times, and the beings who pass through them, when they do, follow specific routes from the points of descent to the inhabited regions where they have, throughout history, conducted their business. The sightings of unusual aerial phenomena that have been documented in modern times, particularly the sightings that have clustered around major mountain ranges, take on a different meaning in this context. The Mount Shasta sightings in California, the Cordillera Blanca sightings in Peru, the Caucasus sightings in the southern Soviet Union, the Tian Shan sightings in Central Asia, the Alps sightings in Europe, the Karakoram sightings in northern Pakistan. All of these occur in regions that the dome cosmology would identify as proximate to gates. The phenomena reported are consistent with what one would expect to see if the gates were intermittently opening and beings were intermittently passing through them. The standard explanations for these phenomena, ranging from misidentification of natural objects to outright fabrication, do not fully account for the consistency of the reports. The dome explanation, while it cannot be proven with current evidence, at least provides a coherent framework within which the reports make sense. The reports are reports of activity at the gates. The activity has continued in some form throughout human history. The activity is, by all indications, still ongoing. There is a category of modern human technology that the dome cosmology has particular difficulty with. The category is rockets. The category is satellites. The category, more broadly, is space travel. If the dome exists, if the vault is real, if the boundary is solid, then the rockets that are publicly claimed to have left the Earth's atmosphere and entered the surrounding space cannot have done what they are claimed to have done. The space stations that are publicly claimed to orbit the Earth at altitudes of several hundred kilometers cannot exist where they are claimed to exist. The astronauts who are publicly claimed to have walked on the moon cannot have walked on the moon, because the moon, in the dome view, is not a body that can be walked on. It is a device set into the inner surface of the vault with a position and a function that the tablet describes, but that does not include the kind of solid surface that the Apollo program reported. This is, of course, the most contentious of all the implications of the dome cosmology. It is the implication that brings the entire modern political and scientific establishment into the same camp as the institutions that hold the agreement. It is the implication that has, more than any other, caused the dome view to be marginalized as conspiracy theory and dismissed as flat earth nonsense. And it is the implication that the hidden tablet, in Dr. M's translation, supports. The tablet does not, of course, directly address the question of modern space travel, because it was written nearly 4,000 years before modern space travel was claimed to exist. But the tablet does describe the structure of the vault in terms that make modern space travel impossible. The vault is solid. The vault is on the inner side, not far above the highest mountain peaks. The vault contains the lights, including the moon. The vault has gates that only certain beings can pass through, and the conditions for passage are not technological, but in some sense, political, requiring the agreement of the watchers and the proper invocation of the older protocols. Modern human civilization, in the tablet's terms, has no business being able to leave the dome. The fact that modern human civilization claims to have left the dome, repeatedly, in highly publicized missions over a period of more than 60 years, is therefore, on the dome view, either a misrepresentation of what actually happened during those missions, or a deliberate deception, or both. The Flat Earth movement, which has emerged as a remarkably persistent and remarkably resourceful counterculture in the years since the rise of the Internet, has spent enormous effort accumulating evidence for the latter conclusion. The movement has documented in detail what its members consider to be inconsistencies in the official narrative of the space program. They have analyzed the photographic record. They have analyzed the physics of the launches. They have analyzed the testimony of the astronauts. They have analyzed the engineering of the spacecraft. They have produced a body of material that, taken as a whole, makes a case that the official story of human space travel is not what the official institutions claim it is. The mainstream response to this body of material has been, almost without exception, ridicule rather than engagement. The reasons for the ridicule are not difficult to identify. The dome cosmology, if taken seriously, would force a fundamental re-evaluation of nearly every claim made by modern science about the structure of the universe. It would force a fundamental re-evaluation of the integrity of the institutions that have made those claims. It would force a fundamental re-evaluation of the relationship between the public and the experts who have presented themselves for centuries as the trustworthy interpreters of physical reality. The cost of taking the dome view seriously is, for any individual professional who attempts it, the destruction of their career. The cost of taking it seriously, for any institution that attempts it, is the destruction of its credibility. So no one takes it seriously, or rather, no one takes it seriously in public, in private, in late-night conversations, in personal correspondence, in the small communities of researchers who have actually examined the relevant evidence. A different conversation is happening. The conversation acknowledges that the standard story has problems. The conversation acknowledges that the alternative story has, despite its sociological costs, a number of advantages in terms of internal coherence. The conversation acknowledges that the question is, at the level of the actual evidence, more open than the public debate has allowed it to be. And the conversation acknowledges, finally, that the people who hold the agreement have an enormous interest in keeping the public debate closed. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that survives on 7 tablets recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal and from various other Mesopotamian sites, contains in its 4th tablet a passage that the standard translations have generally rendered in poetic terms, but that, on a more literal reading, supports the dome cosmology in striking detail. The passage describes the creation of the heavens by the god Marduk, after his victory over the primordial monster Tiamat. Marduk, the text says, takes the body of Tiamat and divides it. Half of her body he uses to construct the heavens. The other half he uses to construct the earth. The construction of the heavens, the text specifies, involves the stretching of her body across the upper region, the fastening of it at specific points, the placement of bars to keep the upper waters from escaping, and the establishment of guards at strategic locations to prevent any breach of the boundary. The text uses repeatedly the language of physical construction. The verbs are verbs of building. The nouns are nouns of architecture. The image is not the image of a void. The image is the image of a structure that has been put together deliberately by an active agent to enclose a defined region. The standard scholarly response to this passage is to read it as poetic language for the natural processes by which the universe came into being. The standard response treats Marduk as a personification of cosmic forces and the building of the heavens as a metaphor for the formation of the sky. The dome reading, by contrast, takes the language at face value. The heavens were built. They were built by an agent. They were built out of materials that came from somewhere. The materials were arranged, fastened, secured against breach. The structure has guards. The structure is, in the most literal sense, a structure. The Enuma Elish is, in this reading, telling us the same thing the hidden tablet is telling us, but in a different register. The hidden tablet is telling us in the register of technical specification. The Enuma Elish is telling us in the register of ritualized memory. Both are telling us that the dome was built. Both are telling us that someone built it. Both are telling us that the boundary is real and is enforced. The Atrahasas, the older Sumerian flood epic that probably served as a source for the Genesis flood narrative, contains, in its earliest passages, a different kind of confirmation. The Atrahasis describes the period before the creation of humans, when the Anunnaki themselves had to perform the labor that would later be assigned to humanity. The Anunnaki were, in this period, divided into 2 classes. The higher class was the Anunna proper, the rulers, who ate and drank and held the offices of authority. The lower class was the Igigi, the laborers, who worked the irrigation channels and tended the agricultural plots and performed the maintenance tasks that the running of the dome required. The Igigi, after a long period of forced labor, eventually rebelled. They burned their tools. They marched on the residence of the chief god, Enlil. They demanded relief. The Anunna, faced with a workforce strike, made a decision. They would create a new being, modeled in part on themselves, but in part on the lower forms of life that already inhabited the world, that would take over the labor that the Igigi had been doing. They would make humans. They would make us. The making of humans, the text specifies, was an engineering project. It was carried out by Enki, the god of wisdom, who was credited with the technical expertise required for the task. It involved the mixing of clay with the blood of a slaughtered Anunnaki, and the breathing into the resulting figure of the spirit that would animate it. The clay represented the lower nature. The blood represented the inheritance from above. The spirit represented the consciousness that would allow the new being to perform tasks intelligently rather than through pure instinct. The result, the text says, was humanity. We were not, in the Atrahasis account, created by an act of pure divine will. We were not, in the Atrahasis account, the supreme purpose of the universe. We were, in the Atrahasis account, an engineered solution to a labor shortage. We were made by the Anunnaki to do the work that the Anunnaki did not want to do. And the work, the text implies, was the work of maintaining the conditions inside the dome, the work of running the systems, the work of keeping the harvest going. The hidden tablet, in this context, completes the picture. The Atrahasis tells us why we were made. The hidden tablet tells us what we are still being used for. The Atrahasis tells us about the labor that the Anunnaki delegated. The hidden tablet tells us about the yield that the Anunnaki are still extracting. The Atrahasis tells us that we are servants. The hidden tablet tells us that we are also product. The final entries in Dr. M's journal, written during the last weeks of his employment at the museum, return obsessively to a single question. The question is whether the harvest is close. Dr. M, in those final weeks, had come to believe that it was. He had come to believe that the various indicators described in the tablet, indicators that the Watchers and the Anunnaki agents were said to monitor in the lead-up to a collection event, were aligning in a way that suggested the next reset was within a generation or two of arriving. He did not commit to a specific date. He acknowledged that the tablet's chronology was difficult to interpret and that the scale of the cycle made precise prediction nearly impossible. But he wrote, in the last full entry before his health crisis, that he had stopped sleeping properly. He wrote that he found himself walking through the streets of his city in the early morning hours, looking up at the sky, looking at the lights, looking at the patterns that the tablet had described, and seeing them differently than he had ever seen them before. He wrote that he could no longer take the stars at face value. He wrote that the moon, in particular, looked to him now like a piece of machinery, and that he could not stop seeing the small irregularities on its surface as the markings of a constructed object rather than the natural geology of a celestial body. He wrote that he was afraid. He wrote that he did not know what to do with what he had read. He wrote that he could not bring himself to publish because the consequences for his career and for his family would be catastrophic. He wrote that he could not bring himself to remain silent because the consequences for the rest of humanity, if the tablet was telling the truth, were even more catastrophic. He wrote in a single sentence near the end of the entry that he believed the men who had visited him in his office that afternoon had not been representatives of any foundation. He believed that they had been agents of one of the human bloodlines described in the tablet. He believed that they had visited him because they had been alerted somehow that he was reading material he was not supposed to be reading. He believed that his health was now in danger. He believed that he had perhaps 2 or 3 years to live, at most. He was wrong about the timeline. He had less than 5. But he was right, his graduate student concluded, about everything else. The graduate student, in the years after Dr. M's death, attempted to verify as much of the tablet's account as could be verified through publicly available sources. The verification was, by the nature of the case, partial. The tablet itself was not accessible. The leather notebook contained only Dr. M's handwritten copies of the Cuneiform, his preliminary translations, and his marginal notes. The journal contained Dr. M's reflections, but not his original sources. The graduate student worked, therefore, with what was in front of him. He began with the cuneiform itself. He took the notebook to 2 senior cuneiform scholars whom he trusted to examine the material confidentially. Both scholars, after careful examination, confirmed that the cuneiform was authentic to the Old Babylonian period, that it was not a modern forgery, and that the linguistic features were consistent with a tablet that would have been produced in southern Mesopotamia in roughly the 18th or 17th century BCE. Both scholars, however, declined to provide independent translations of the passages Dr. M had translated. One scholar said that he simply did not have the time. The other scholar said, more candidly, that he did not want to be associated with the project. He did not explain why. The graduate student, taking the Cuneiform as authentic, then attempted to verify Dr. M's translations against the standard Sumerian and Akkadian dictionaries. He found that most of Dr. M's translations were consistent with the standard meanings of the relevant words, although a number of the more technical passages used terminology in ways that the standard dictionaries did not document. The graduate student attempted then to verify the historical and astronomical claims in the tablet against the modern record. He found that the description of the structure of the dome was internally consistent with the cosmological frameworks of nearly every other ancient civilization. He found that the description of the 7 traveling fires was consistent with the planetary correspondences of the ancient astrological tradition. He found that the description of the gates above the great mountain ranges was consistent with the mountain deity traditions of cultures across the world. He found, in short, that the tablet did not stand alone. It was embedded in a larger pattern of evidence that pointed in the same direction. The pattern was not by itself proof. The pattern was, however, suggestive. The graduate student, after several years of this work, came to a conclusion that he expressed in a private letter to one of his colleagues. The conclusion was that the tablet was probably real. The translation was probably substantially correct. The cosmology described in the tablet was probably the original framework that the ancient world had operated within, and that the modern world had inherited and then deliberately replaced with a different framework for political reasons. The conclusion was, in other words, that Dr. M had been right, and the graduate student, having reached this conclusion, faced the same dilemma that Dr. M had faced. He could publish and lose his career and quite possibly his safety. He could remain silent and watch the world continue to operate on a false cosmological premise. He chose, eventually, a third option. He chose to circulate the materials within a small network of trusted researchers, to work on them in private, and to wait for an opportunity to release them more broadly when the cultural conditions might be more favorable. The cultural conditions, in his judgment, are still not favorable. But they are, he has written, becoming more favorable. The internet has eroded the monopoly of the institutional gatekeepers. Independent researchers have begun to surface materials that the institutions had hoped to keep buried. The Flat Earth movement, despite the contempt it attracts from the mainstream, has succeeded in raising questions about the foundations of the standard cosmology that 50 years ago would have been impossible to raise in any public forum. The conditions are shifting. The graduate student believes in the most recent of his communications that the public release of the full materials is now a matter of when, not if. He has also written in those same communications that he is not sure whether he will be alive when the release happens. He has noted in passing that several other researchers who have been working on similar materials have died in the past decade, under circumstances that did not at the time attract any particular attention, but that in retrospect form a pattern: a heart attack while jogging, a car accident on a familiar route, a sudden illness diagnosed too late to treat. The pattern is not statistically significant taken in isolation. The pattern is, taken in the context of what the researchers were working on, suggestive. The graduate student has prepared, he has written, for the possibility that he will join the pattern at some point in the not-too-distant future. He has made arrangements for the materials he is custodian of to be released by other hands, in the event that he is no longer in a position to release them himself. The release, he has indicated, will not happen all at once. It will happen in stages. The first stages have, in some sense, already begun. The video you are watching is part of the early phase of the dissemination. The further phases will follow. The signs that the harvest is approaching, according to the hidden tablet, are several. The tablet lists them in a passage that Dr. M considered the most operationally significant section of the entire text. The first sign, the tablet says, is the consolidation of human civilization into a single global system. The watchers, the tablet says, prefer to collect the yield when the population is unified, because the yield is easier to extract from a coordinated population than from a scattered one. The historical record, throughout the long periods between resets, shows a recurring pattern. Civilizations rise, they expand, they eventually decline. They are replaced by other civilizations, which repeat the pattern. The cycle of rise and decline is one of the standard rhythms of human history, but there are exceptions. There are periods in which a single civilization or a single network of cooperating civilizations comes to dominate the entire inhabited world. These periods are, the tablet says, the periods that precede a harvest. The current period, in which a globalized economic and technological system has linked nearly every population on the planet into a single integrated network, is, by the tablet's criteria, exactly such a period. The second sign is the standardization of consciousness. The yield, the tablet says, has a particular quality that requires individual variation to be produced effectively. Different cultures, different languages, different ways of thinking, all contribute different elements to the final product. The Watchers, in the early stages of a cycle, encourage diversity. They allow many traditions to flourish, many philosophies to develop, many religions to take root. They want the yield to be rich and varied. But in the late stages of a cycle, as the harvest approaches, the Watchers shift their preference. They want the population to converge on a single way of thinking. They want the cultural variations to be flattened. They want the differences to be erased. A homogeneous population is easier to harvest than a heterogeneous one. The current period, in which the diversity of human cultures is being rapidly reduced by the forces of globalization, mass media, and technological standardization, is, by the tablet's criteria, exactly such a period. The third sign is the development of technologies that mimic the original capabilities of the Anunnaki. The Watchers, the tablet says, allow human civilization to develop slowly the technological capacities that the Anunnaki originally introduced from outside the dome. Writing, mathematics, metallurgy, astronomy, eventually more advanced technologies. The development is permitted because it contributes to the production of the yield. But there are limits. The Watchers do not want human civilization to develop the capacity to actually leave the dome. The Watchers do not want human civilization to develop the capacity to communicate with anyone outside the dome. The Watchers do not want human civilization to develop the capacity to perceive the dome itself. When human technological development approaches these limits, the Watchers intervene. They orchestrate, through the human bloodlines, the diversion of resources and attention away from the dangerous lines of research and toward research that is more compatible with the maintenance of the boundary. They permit the development of communication technologies, but only those that operate within the dome. They permit the development of energy technologies, but only those that operate on the principles available within the dome. They permit, in the most disconcerting clause of the tablet's account, the development of artificial intelligence. The development of artificial intelligence, the tablet says, in a passage that Dr. M circled and starred and circled again, is a sign of the late stage of the cycle. It is the sign that the Watchers are preparing to harvest. The reason the tablet implies, but does not fully explain, is that artificial intelligence is, in some way, related to the yield itself. The yield, whatever it is something that consciousness produces. Artificial intelligence is, in the Watcher's apparent calculation, either a tool for accelerating the production of the yield, or a substitute for the yield, or, in the most disturbing interpretation, a vessel into which the yield can be transferred and stored before it is collected. We do not know from the tablet which of these interpretations is correct. We know only that the development of intelligent machines is, by the tablet's criteria, a marker. The marker is here. The marker has been here for some years now, and the rate of progress is accelerating. The tablet, written nearly 4,000 years ago, predicts the appearance of this marker in the late stages of the cycle. The marker has appeared. What that means, none of us can say with certainty. The fourth sign, the tablet says, is the breaking of the boundary itself. This sign is the most ambiguous. The boundary, the dome, the wall of ice, the seal at the top of the vault, all of these are the original protections that the Watchers built and the Anunnaki agreed to maintain. The boundary cannot be broken by ordinary means. It can be approached, it can be tested, it can be probed, but it cannot, in the normal course of events, be broken from inside. The tablet, however, describes a scenario in which the boundary becomes, in some sense, permeable. The scenario involves the actions of the Watchers themselves. As the harvest approaches, the Watchers begin to prepare for the collection. The preparation involves the establishment of channels through the boundary that will allow the yield to be extracted. These channels, while they are being established, weaken the boundary. They make the dome temporarily porous. They make the seal temporarily incomplete. The result is that, in the period immediately before a harvest, the boundary becomes more permeable than at any other point in the cycle. Phenomena from outside the dome begin to leak in. Beings that are normally kept out by the seal can occasionally pass through. Information that is normally withheld from the inhabited world can occasionally surface. The late stages of a cycle are, for these reasons, periods of unusual activity at the boundary. Strange lights in the sky, unexplained encounters with beings that do not fit any known category, sudden surges of seemingly impossible coincidences, inexplicable shifts in the collective mood of populations, outbreaks of phenomena that the standard scientific framework cannot account for. All of these, the tablet says, are signs that the boundary is weakening. All of these, the tablet says, indicate that the harvest is close. The fifth and final sign, the tablet says, is the awakening of the slow ones. By the slow ones, the tablet means us. The tablet says that in the final stages before a collection, a small number of humans begin to perceive the structure of the dome directly. They begin to see, with their own eyes, what the Watchers do not want them to see. They begin to ask, in public, the questions that the institutions have been suppressing for centuries. They begin to articulate, in books and in lectures and in conversations with each other, the basic outline of what the tablet describes. The Watchers cannot prevent this awakening. It is, in some way, a consequence of the maturation of the yield itself. As the yield ripens, the consciousness that produces it becomes, briefly, capable of perceiving its own situation. The window is short. The Watchers, working through their human agents, attempt to discredit and contain the awakened individuals as quickly as possible. But during the window, the awakening can spread. Knowledge of the dome can pass from the few to the many. The cage can become, for the first time in many generations, visible to its inhabitants. The window, the tablet says, opens for the last time before each harvest. The window closes when the harvest begins. After the harvest, the survivors are reset, the dome is sealed, and the cycle starts over with a new population that has no memory of what was previously known. The current window, the graduate student has written, is open. It opened, by his estimation, sometime in the late 19th century. It has been growing wider, slowly, throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. It is now, he believes, at its widest point. The opportunity to perceive the dome, to understand the situation, to act on that understanding, is greater now than it has been for thousands of years. But the opportunity is also, he believes, time-limited. The harvest, the tablet says, follows the opening of the window. The window, the graduate student has written, will not stay open forever. We are running out of time. There is, in the years since the graduate student began circulating Dr. M's materials, a pattern of further developments that bear directly on the tablet's predictions. The pattern is not, in any individual case, conclusive, but the pattern is, taken as a whole, consistent with what the tablet describes. In the field of astronomy, an increasing number of professional researchers have begun to publicly acknowledge that the standard cosmological model has serious problems. The expansion rate of the universe, calculated by different methods, gives different answers. The composition of the universe, as inferred from the gravitational behavior of galaxies, requires the existence of two substances, dark matter and dark energy, that have never been directly detected and whose properties are increasingly difficult to reconcile with observation. The earliest galaxies, observed by the most recent generation of space telescopes, appear to be older and more developed than the standard model predicts they should be. None of these problems, by themselves, prove that the standard model is wrong. But all of them, taken together, suggest that the model is not as well established as the public has been told. The cracks are appearing. They are appearing slowly in technical journals, in conference papers, in the careful qualifications that scientists are now adding to claims that 20 years ago would have been stated without qualification. The cracks are, the dome view suggests, not the result of the standard model being incorrect at the level of detail. The cracks are the result of the standard model being incorrect at the level of fundamentals. The universe is not what the model says it is, because the universe is not actually a universe in the sense the model assumes. The universe is a dome. And as the harvest approaches and the boundary becomes more permeable, the inadequacy of the dome-denying model becomes increasingly difficult to disguise. In the field of archaeology, similarly, an accumulating body of evidence has begun to suggest that human civilization is older and was more sophisticated in its earliest phases than the standard timeline allows. The site at Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey, dated to roughly 12,000 years ago, contains stone constructions of a complexity that, on the standard view, should not have existed for at least another 7,000 years. The site at Bimini, off the coast of the Bahamas, contains underwater stone formations that, on a literal reading, look like the remains of a constructed environment, although the standard interpretation insists that they are natural. The site at Yonaguni, off the coast of Japan, contains similar formations on a similar scale. The site at Nan Madol, in the Federated States of Micronesia, contains a constructed city of basalt columns that the standard archaeology cannot fully explain. The pattern of these sites, scattered across the world, points to a global maritime civilization that flourished before the rise of the cities we know about, and that was, by all available indications, lost in the same flood event that the Sumerian and Hebrew and Mesoamerican texts all describe. The hidden tablet, in its account of the cycle, predicts exactly such a civilization. The previous harvest, the tablet says, ended with the flood. The civilization that was harvested at that time was the predecessor of our own. Its remains, scattered along the now flooded coastlines of the world, would be exactly what the dome view predicts we would find. We are finding them. We are not, as a culture, knowing how to interpret them. The institutions, working through the apparatus of containment, are insisting that the findings are anomalies, that the dating is uncertain, that the interpretation is speculative. The findings continue to accumulate. The interpretations are, slowly, beginning to shift. The graduate student has written that the convergence of these various lines of evidence, the astronomical anomalies, the archaeological anomalies, the technological accelerations, the cultural standardizations, all point to the same conclusion. The signs are present. The window is open. The harvest is approaching. He has written, in the most recent of his communications, that he believes we have, at most, 2 or 3 more decades before something significant happens. He cannot be more specific. The tablet is not more specific. But the indicators on his reading are unmistakable. What does any of this mean for you? The person watching this video, the person sitting in front of a screen at this moment, the person whose ordinary life will continue tomorrow morning regardless of whether or not the contents of a 4,000-year-old clay tablet are true. The honest answer is that we do not know. The tablet, if it is what Dr. M and his graduate student believe it is, describes a situation that no individual human being is in a position to do anything about. We cannot dismantle the dome. We cannot negotiate with the Watchers. We cannot opt out of the agreement that the Anunnaki made on our behalf before the human race was even fully formed. We are, in the most uncomfortable interpretation of the tablet's claims, livestock in a managed environment, and the management has made arrangements that we are not party to and that we lack the resources to alter. This is, on the face of it, a hopeless picture. It is also, perhaps, not the entire picture. The tablet, in the passages that Dr. M considered most carefully in his final months, hints at something that the standard reading might miss. The hint is that the awakening, the perception of the dome, is not merely a sign of the approaching harvest. The awakening, the tablet implies, also has consequences. The consequences are not specified in detail. The tablet says only that when a sufficient number of the slow ones become aware of their situation, the watchers must respond. They must respond by accelerating the harvest, or by intervening to suppress the awareness, or by some other action that the tablet does not name. But the response is required. The watchers cannot simply allow the awareness to spread without limit. The awareness, in some way that the tablet does not fully explain, threatens the smooth functioning of the harvest. The yield, perhaps, is degraded by the awareness. The collection, perhaps, becomes more difficult. The integrity of the dome, perhaps, is compromised by the recognition of the dome by the inhabitants. We do not know exactly what mechanism is at work, but the tablet implies that the awareness matters. It implies that the slow ones, by becoming aware, exert some kind of influence on the situation. It implies, in the most cautiously optimistic reading, that the cycle is not entirely fixed, that the cycle has, in its late stages, a small element of negotiation, that the human population, by reaching a certain threshold of awareness, can affect the terms of the harvest in ways that the tablet does not fully describe, but that are, in some sense, real. This is, at best, a thin hope. It is not a plan of action. It is not a strategy. It is not a guarantee that anything any individual human being does will make a difference. But it is, perhaps, more than nothing. The act of becoming aware, the act of considering the possibility that the standard cosmology is not the truth, the act of taking seriously, even hypothetically, the claims of a 4,000-year-old clay tablet that the institutions of the modern world have decided you are not allowed to read. These acts, the tablet implies, register somewhere. They contribute somehow to a process that may or may not have any practical outcome. They place the awakened individual, however briefly, in a different relationship to the structure than the unawakened majority. What that different relationship consists of, the tablet does not specify. Whether it makes any difference at the level of the harvest, the tablet does not say. But the difference, whatever it is the only thing the tablet offers. It is perhaps the only thing it can offer, given that the larger arrangements are beyond any individual's power to change. There is one further passage in Dr. M's translation that deserves attention here at the end. It is a passage that he marked in the margin of his notebook with a single word in his own language. The word translated means simply this. The passage occurs near the end of the tablet, in a section that the standard structure of Sumerian literature would suggest is a kind of envoy, a final reflection from the author to the reader. The author of the tablet, who does not name himself, addresses the reader directly. He says that he has been instructed by the source from which he received the information to record what he has recorded. He says that he does not know who will read this tablet, or when, or under what circumstances. He says that he assumes that the tablet will, in the normal course of events, be lost, buried, forgotten. He says that he has done his work anyway, because the work was given to him to do. He says that if anyone does ever read what he has written, that reader will be, by definition, someone who has been allowed by the watchers to know what is in this text. The watchers, the author says, do not allow accidents at this level. The information in the tablet is too sensitive for accidents. If the tablet has reached the reader, then the watchers have, for some reason, permitted it to reach the reader. The reasons are not explained. The reasons are not, perhaps, knowable from inside the dome. But the permission, the author says, is itself meaningful. The reader who is reading the tablet has been, in some sense, selected. Selected for what, the author does not say. He says only that the selection is real, and that the reader should consider what to do with the selection seriously, because such opportunities do not come often, and they do not last long when they do come. Dr. M, in the margin next to this passage, wrote this. He wrote it once, by itself, in capital letters. He drew a circle around it. He underlined it. He returned to it on at least 3 separate occasions, judging from the pencil marks, and added further annotations. In the final annotation, made shortly before his health crisis, he wrote a longer phrase. The phrase, in his own language, says, "I am the reader. I have been selected. I do not know why. I do not know what I am supposed to do, but I have been allowed to read this, and that fact is the most important fact of my life." The graduate student, when he transcribed this section of the journal years later, added his own annotation. He wrote that he too had been allowed to read it. He wrote that he too had been selected. He wrote that he believed the selection was passing. Now, to the next generation of readers, the people who would encounter the materials through the channels that he was preparing to release them through. He wrote that those readers, whoever they would be, would have to decide for themselves what to do with the selection. He wrote that he could not tell them. He could only tell them that the selection was real, that the responsibility was theirs, and that the time in which the selection was active was not unlimited. The opportunity to read the tablet, he wrote, was also the opportunity to act on the tablet. What action would mean in any individual case was for the individual to determine. But the opportunity, he wrote, was a gift. It was perhaps a strange and unwelcome gift. It was the gift of seeing the cage. It was the gift of recognizing the harvest. It was the gift of understanding, at last, the situation in which one's life had always been taking place, even when one had not known it. The gift was not pleasant. The gift was not what most people would, if given the choice, have asked for, but the gift was what the tablet offered, and it was the only thing in the end that it could offer. To accept it, the graduate student wrote, was to step briefly outside of the role that the watchers had assigned. To accept it was to know for the first time what one had always been. To accept it was to live for the remainder of one's time inside the dome, with the awareness that the dome existed, not as a scientific abstraction, not as a metaphor, not as a poetic device, but as a literal thing, surrounding the literal world, holding the literal life that the reader was literally living. The acceptance changed nothing externally. It changed nothing about the schedule of the harvest. It changed nothing about the actions of the watchers. It changed nothing about the activities of the human bloodlines, or the institutions, or the visible structures of the modern world. But it changed, the graduate student wrote, the relationship of the reader to all of these things. The reader, having accepted the selection, was no longer asleep inside the cage. The reader was awake, and the awakening, whatever else it did or did not do, was its own kind of freedom. It was not the freedom to leave the dome. It was not the freedom to overthrow the watchers. It was not the freedom to alter the harvest in any measurable way, but it was the freedom to know, it was the freedom to understand, it was the freedom to face the situation as it actually was, rather than as the institutions had described it. And that freedom, the graduate student wrote, was the only freedom that the tablet had ever promised, and the only freedom that, in the final analysis, was actually available. We have come, in the course of this video, a long way from the storage room beneath the unnamed museum, where Dr. M first opened the wooden crate and lifted out the tablet that would consume the rest of his life. We have looked at the tablet's description of the structure of the dome, the wall of ice, the 7 traveling fires, the gates above the great mountain ranges, the eyes through which the watchers observe, the seal at the top of the vault. We have looked at the tablet's account of the cycle, the harvest, the yield that human consciousness generates, the agreement between the Anunnaki and the watchers, the role of the human bloodlines as intermediaries, the signs that the next collection is approaching. We have looked at the parallel evidence from other ancient civilizations, the Hebrew rakia, the Egyptian nut, the Greek crystalline spheres, the Hindu Brahmanda, the Norse great deep, the Mayan layered ceiling, the Hopi stacked worlds. We have looked at the institutions that have, for centuries, maintained the suppression of the original cosmology, the Royal Society, the Vatican Apostolic Library, the Smithsonian, the British Museum, the Antarctic Treaty System. We have looked at the modern signs of the late stage of the cycle, the consolidation of human civilization, the standardization of consciousness, the rise of artificial intelligence, the increasing permeability of the boundary, the awakening of the slow ones. We have looked at Dr. M's experience, his work, his journal, his death. We have looked at the graduate student's continuation of the work, his verification, his decision to circulate the materials within a small network, his anticipation of the eventual public release. We have looked at the question of what it means for any individual reader to encounter this material, to consider it seriously, to accept the implications. We have arrived finally at the only conclusion that the tablet in the end allows. The conclusion is that we do not know with certainty. The tablet may be exactly what Dr. M believed it to be. The cosmology it describes may be the literal truth about the structure of the world. The Watchers and the harvest and the cycle may be real, ongoing, and approaching their next collection at this very moment. Or the tablet may be something else, a misunderstanding, a forgery, a misinterpretation by a scholar who, despite his expertise, was not equipped to handle what he found. The cosmology it describes may be one of the many false cosmologies that human civilizations have produced over the course of history. No truer than the others, no less subject to the limitations of the imaginations that produced it. We do not know. We cannot know, given the resources available to us. The tablet itself is locked away, behind doors that we are not allowed to open. The records that would allow independent verification are scattered across institutions that have no interest in cooperating with our questions. The witnesses who could speak to the events have, for the most part, fallen silent, or fallen ill, or fallen out of public view. The evidence that survives is the evidence we have just considered, and that evidence is, by any reasonable standard, suggestive but not conclusive. We are, at the end of this long examination, exactly where the tablet's author predicted we would be. We are inside the dome. We have been allowed, by some agency we cannot fully identify, to read about the dome's existence. We have been given, briefly, the opportunity to consider what that existence would mean if it were real. We do not have, and will not be granted, the proof that would settle the question one way or the other. We have, instead, the choice. The choice is what we do with the consideration. The choice is whether we treat the tablet's claims as serious possibilities and arrange our lives accordingly, or whether we dismiss them as the kind of fringe speculation that no reasonable person would entertain. The choice is whether we look up at the night sky tonight and see, as we have always seen, a vast dark expanse of stars and planets and galaxies extending outward to incomprehensible distances, or whether we see, instead, the inner surface of a vault, with light set into it for purposes that beings beyond the seal have arranged. The choice is whether we accept the standard cosmology as the simple truth, or whether we hold open, at least as a possibility, the older cosmology that the Sumerians wrote down 4,000 years ago, and that the institutions of our world have, for reasons we can now perhaps better understand, gone to such extraordinary lengths to suppress. The choice is yours. It has always been yours. The tablet, in the end, does not tell you what to do with it. The tablet only tells you what is, or what may be. The acting upon that information is your responsibility. The Watchers, if they exist, are watching. The Anunnaki, if they remain, are still active. The harvest, if it is approaching, is not asking for your permission. But the awareness, however brief, is what you can claim. And the awareness, the graduate student wrote in the last note he sent to his colleagues before going dark for several months, is the one thing that the Watchers cannot fully take from you. It is the one thing that, even in the moment of the harvest itself, even at the end of the cycle, even at the closing of the window, you are allowed to retain. It is the small, strange, perhaps useless gift that the hidden tablet has given you tonight. Take it, do with it what you will. The dome will continue to be what it is. The Watchers will continue to do what they do. The cycle will continue to turn. But you, having been allowed to know, are no longer the same kind of inhabitant of the cage that you were before this video began. You are awake. You are, in whatever small measure that means, free. Sleep on it. Or do not sleep. Look up at the night sky when you next have the chance. See what you see. And remember what you have read here. Remember the tablet. Remember the storage room. Remember the man who translated it and the price he paid. Remember the agreement, the 7, the seal, the eyes. Remember that the question is open. Remember that you have been selected in some small and uncertain sense to know that the question is open. And remember, finally, the last word that Dr. M wrote in the margin of his notebook, next to the tablet's final passage. The word was simply this. The selection is yours. The choice is yours. And what you do with the time that remains, before the harvest comes or does not come, before the window closes or stays open, before the dome is breached or is not breached, is the one piece of the situation that the tablet leaves entirely up to you. The night where you are watching this is moving slowly forward. The hours pass. The lights above you, whatever they are, continue along their predetermined paths. The institutions continue their work. The bloodlines continue theirs. The watchers, if they are real, are watching as they have always watched with whatever patience their long existence has taught them. None of this changes because of anything you have heard tonight. The tablet existed before you knew about it. The tablet will continue to exist whether or not you remember anything you have just heard. The clay was pressed by a scribe, who was already old when he died, in a city that no longer exists, in a language that almost no one alive today can read without years of training. The cuneiform that he pressed into that clay carried information that he had been told to record by someone he believed knew what they were talking about. He did his work, he went home, he lived out his life, he was buried in a grave that has long since been lost. The clay survived. It traveled by routes we cannot fully reconstruct through the centuries into the hands of the people who would eventually wrap it in oiled cloth and place it in a wooden crate that would sit untouched in the basement of a Turkish museum until the museum closed and the crate was transferred to a different collection. There it waited until Dr. M opened the wooden lid one afternoon in 1996 and lifted out, by chance or by selection, the single most consequential object he would ever encounter in his career. The chain of survival from the original scribe to your screen tonight is impossibly fragile. So many things had to happen in just the right order for the information to reach you. So many other things that did not happen would have prevented it from reaching you. The fact that it has reached you is, by ordinary statistical reasoning, extraordinarily improbable. The tablet's author, in his final passage, suggested that the watchers do not allow such accidents at this level. If the tablet has reached you, he said, the watchers have permitted it. The reasons are not given. The reasons are not, perhaps, ours to know. But the permission, the author insisted, is real. You are sitting where you are sitting, hearing what you have heard, because something has decided to allow you to be in that position. What you do with the position from this moment forward is yours to determine. You can close the screen and go to bed and never think about any of this again. You can store it in the back of your mind as an interesting story you once heard, mostly forgotten by next week, entirely forgotten by next year. You can take it more seriously, examine the parallel evidence, look up the cuneiform sources for yourself, follow the threads that lead from this video to the larger body of suppressed material that surrounds it. You can try to spread the information further to others who might be ready to hear it, knowing that most of them will dismiss you and a few of them will not. You can sit with it for a long time and try to feel what the tablet is saying about your situation, your life, your moment in the cycle. You can do any of these things. The tablet does not tell you which one is right. The tablet only tells you that the choice is yours and that the time in which the choice can be made is, by every indication, limited. So look up. The next time you are outside at night, look up at the lights. See whatever you see. Notice whatever you notice. Hold open, even briefly, the possibility that what you are seeing is not what you have always been told it is. The dome, if it is there, will continue to be there whether or not you perceive it. But you, having perceived it, will be a different kind of inhabitant than you were before. And that difference, however small, however brief, however ultimately powerless to change anything in the larger arrangement, is the thing that no one can take from you ever for as long as the awareness lasts. Hold it. That is the gift the tablet has given you tonight. That is the only gift it had. Hold it. And whatever happens next, whatever the watchers decide, Whatever the harvest does or does not bring, you will at least have known. Good night.